Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. It started with the dog. Every night, as the family sat down for dinner, the dog would be there, watching. The old golden retriever, its fur patchy and matted, sat perfectly still in the neighbor's window. Its wide, glassy eyes never wavered, locked onto their dining table like it was waiting for something. "That dog gives me the creeps," Emily said one evening, setting her fork down. "It's just a dog," Mark, her husband, said without looking up from his plate. "No, it's weird. It doesn't move. It just stares." Their daughter, Lily, only 6 years old, poked at her mashed potatoes. "Maybe it's lonely," she murmured. Emily turned back to the window. The dog was still there, its unblinking gaze meeting hers. Later that night, when she was doing the dishes, she glanced outside again. The dog was still in the same position. The lights in the neighbor's house were off, yet those eerie eyes remained visible, reflecting the dim glow of a street lamp. "Mark," she whispered, nudging him awake once they were in bed. "That dog hasn't moved all night." He groaned. Emily, go to sleep. But she couldn't. Something about the way the dog watched them made her uneasy. The next morning, she decided to bring it up with Mrs. Hutchins, their elderly neighbor. The woman had lived in the house next door for decades, alone since her husband passed. Emily figured maybe the dog was old too. Maybe it was sick or suffering from dementia or something. She rang the doorbell and waited. Mrs. Hutchins finally answered, her frail body wrapped in a knitted cardigan. Her expression was kind but distant. "Good morning, dear," she said. "Hi, Mrs. Hutchins. I just wanted to ask about your dog. I keep seeing it in the window every night. Is everything okay with it?" The old woman's face changed. The warmth drained away, replaced by something unreadable. "Dog?" she asked softly. "Yes, the golden retriever. It's always sitting in your window, watching our house." Mrs. Hutchins took a step back, gripping the doorframe. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head. "You must be mistaken. My dog died 12 years ago." Emily felt a chill run through her. "No, I saw it. Every night. It's there, just sitting." Mrs. Hutchins' lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not possible," she said. Then, with a firm but shaky voice, she added, "Please don't ask me about it again." And with that, she shut the door. Emily stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding. That night, she couldn't bring herself to look at the window. But she didn't need to. She could feel it watching. Emily tried to ignore it. She told herself it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Mrs. Hutchins had another dog she didn't want to talk about. Maybe she had forgotten. But that night, the staring continued. At dinner, Mark noticed her glancing at the window. "You're obsessing over this," he muttered, cutting into his steak. "It's just off," Emily whispered. "She told me the dog's been dead for years, Mark. But I see it. Every night." Mark sighed. Maybe she got another dog and just doesn't want to admit it. Or maybe it's a statue, a weird decoration. Emily clenched her jaw. "It blinks." Mark stopped chewing. Across the table, Lily had her fork poised in midair. "I don't like it either," she mumbled. Emily exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Look, can you check later? Just to make sure I'm not crazy." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. If it's still there tonight, I'll take a look." That night, Emily sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV. She wasn't paying attention to the show, though. Her eyes kept flicking toward the darkened window. Mark finally sighed. "All right, I'm checking." He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. Emily watched through the window as he crossed their lawn and headed toward the neighbor's house. The old place was quiet, its windows dark except for one, the one where the dog always sat. Mark lifted the flashlight, the beam slicing through the night. The moment the light touched the window, the dog's head moved. Emily gasped. Mark took a step back. No way, he muttered under his breath. The dog didn't move again. It just sat there, staring. Mark turned the flashlight off and marched back inside. Okay, he said, voice tight. That's freaky. Emily wrapped her arms around herself. I told you. He shook his head. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not going to lose sleep over some old lady's creepy dog. Emily swallowed hard. It's not her dog. Not anymore. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those glassy, unblinking eyes. At 3 a.m., she woke up suddenly, her chest tight with unease. The room was silent. Mark was asleep beside her. Something felt wrong. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The dog was no longer in the neighbor's house. It was in their yard. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The dog sat perfectly still in the middle of their yard, its head slightly tilted, its lifeless eyes reflecting the dim glow of the porch light. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the image away. I'm dreaming. I have to be dreaming. But when she opened them again, the dog was still there. Her fingers trembled as she reached out and shook Mark's shoulder. Mark, she whispered, but he only groaned and turned onto his side. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She didn't want to look at it anymore, but she couldn't seem to move. And then, the dog stood up. Emily let out a sharp gasp. Its movements were unnatural, stiff, like something was pulling its limbs into place instead of them moving on their own. It took a slow step forward. Emily's body finally unfroze. She yanked the blankets over her head like a child hiding from a nightmare. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Eventually, exhaustion won. She fell asleep. The next morning, she bolted upright the moment sunlight streamed through the window. Her heart was still racing from the night before. She rushed to the window and looked outside. The dog was gone. Mark sat up groggily. What's wrong? Emily swallowed. It was in the yard last night, she whispered. Mark frowned. What was? The dog. It moved. I swear it was just sitting there, staring at the house. Mark sighed. Em, you're freaking yourself out over nothing. Maybe it was a coyote or something. She clenched her jaw. It wasn't a coyote. Mark rubbed his eyes. All right, I'll check the yard. Maybe there are footprints or something. Emily nodded quickly, but deep down, she knew what he would find. Nothing. And she was right. There were no paw prints in the damp grass. No signs that anything had been there at all. Mark scratched his head. Maybe you were dreaming. Emily didn't argue, but in her gut, she knew it hadn't been a dream. That night, she closed all the blinds. If I don't see it, it doesn't exist, she whispered to herself. But even behind the closed blinds, she could still feel it watching. She could feel it getting closer. Emily stayed awake as long as she could, curled up on the couch with her knees tucked to her chest. Every light in the house was on. The TV played softly in the background, but she wasn't really watching. She was listening for movement outside, for a scratch at the door, for anything. Mark had gone to bed an hour ago, mumbling something about her paranoia getting worse. Lily had already been asleep. Emily knew she should sleep too, but every time her eyes started to close, she felt it, the weight of something watching her. She glanced at the blinds, debating whether she should peek. But she knew if she looked, she would see it, and if she saw it, she would know for sure that it was real. The thought made her stomach turn. Finally, exhaustion won again. She leaned back against the couch, promising herself she'd only rest for a few minutes. Then, tap, tap, tap. Emily's eyes shot open. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it made her blood run cold. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking was coming from the front door. She sat frozen, barely breathing. No. It was almost 3 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? Her mind raced. A neighbor in trouble? Someone lost? Or something else? Tap, tap, tap. Slow, steady, too patient. She turned her head toward the hallway. Mark was still in the bedroom, asleep. If she woke him up, he'd tell her she was imagining things. She looked back at the door. Say nothing. Don't move. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the knocking to stop. It did. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, guttural scratching sound ran across the door. Emily's breath hitched. Her hands clenched the blanket around her shoulders, knuckles turning white. She wanted to run, to wake Mark, to scream. But she did none of those things. She just sat there, her body locked in place, her heartbeat slamming in her chest. The scratching dragged down the wood, slow and deliberate like nails or claws pressing deep. Then finally, a voice. Low, rough, a whisper through the crack of the door. Let me in. Emily's throat tightened. The voice was wrong. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like something trying to be a person. She pressed a hand over her mouth, as if that could stop the sharp breaths escaping her lips. Silence. Then, I know you're in there. The whisper slithered through the wood, creeping into her ears like a cold breath against her skin. Emily forced herself to move. She slid off the couch, lowering herself onto the floor, trying to stay out of sight. Her pulse roared in her head. She reached for her phone. Call someone. Call anyone. Her fingers fumbled with the screen, but before she could dial, the doorknob rattled. A sharp, twisting motion, like something was trying to force it open. She sucked in a shaky breath. Then it stopped. Everything went quiet again. Emily's ears strained in the silence, every muscle in her body coiled tight. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever it was had left. Then she heard it. A wet, scraping sound. Not against the door this time. Against the window. Emily's stomach lurched. No. No, no, no. She turned her head slowly, dread tightening her chest. The blinds were still closed, but behind them she saw the shape. Tall, still, waiting. She couldn't see its face, but she knew it was looking at her. Her body screamed at her to run, to get Mark, to do something, but she couldn't move. Then, the blinds shifted. Not much, just enough for her to see between the slats. Enough to see the thing on the other side. And it wasn't a person. It wasn't even close. It was the dog, but its head was too high, too tall, as if it were standing on two legs. And its mouth, it was stretched wide in a grin that was too human. Emily's breath hitched. Then the worst part, it spoke. Why won't you look at me? Emily's body refused to move. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to wake Mark, to do something. But she couldn't. She was trapped, caught in the weight of that voice, low, unnatural, curling around her like smoke. Why won't you look at me? The thing outside pressed closer to the window. The blinds bowed inward as if something heavy leaned against them. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. If she didn't look, maybe it would go away. Maybe it would stop. She held her breath. Silence. Then, the sound of claws dragging down the glass. Long, slow. The whisper came again, teasing. I know you see me. Emily swallowed hard, her entire body trembling. She tried to breathe quietly, but her chest heaved in short, panicked bursts. Then the worst sound yet. The blinds shifted. Not by themselves. Something was lifting them. Emily snapped her head away, staring at the floor, refusing to see. Look at me. A single finger, no, a claw, hooked under the blinds. Lifting. Higher. Higher. A shadow stretched across the living room floor. Then, a deep, guttural growl. The voice was gone. It wasn't speaking anymore. It was angry. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on Emily's chest like she was being watched from all sides. Then, the sound of something moving. Not away. To the front door. Emily's stomach clenched. Her pulse pounded against her skull as she scrambled backward on the floor. It's coming inside. She had to move. Had to wake Mark. Had to. A soft click. The sound of the door unlocking. No. No, no, no. Her body jolted into action. She launched to her feet and ran. Straight down the hall. Straight to the bedroom. Straight to Mark. She shoved the door open, heart slamming against her ribs. Mark. But Mark wasn't in bed. The sheets were thrown back. The mattress empty. And the bedroom window, wide open. The curtains billowed softly in the cold night air. Emily's breath caught. She took a shaky step forward. Then she saw them. The footprints. Leading out. Not human. Deep clawed imprints in the carpet. Leading to the window. Leading outside. And then, from the darkness beyond the glass, a voice. Come see the dog, Emily. Emily froze. The voice was wrong. It had Mark's tone, Mark's cadence. But it wasn't him. It couldn't be. Her whole body screamed at her not to move, not to go near the window. But her feet carried her forward anyway, slow, trembling steps across the carpet. The night outside was thick, black, endless. She couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the neighbor's porch light. The dog wasn't in the window anymore. Neither was Mark. Come see the dog. This time, the voice was farther away. Emily's hands clenched into fists. Her breathing came in sharp, shallow gasps as she reached for her phone. She needed to call someone. Anyone. But before she could dial, her screen lit up. An incoming call. From Mark. Her stomach lurched. Her thumb hovered over the screen. The phone rang again. And then, Emily, the voice on the phone whispered. It was Mark. But it wasn't. It was too slow. Too deep. Like something was wearing his voice. She choked on a breath and hung up. The phone rang again. She turned it off. Silence. Then, a sound from outside. A low whimper. The dog. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped toward the window, just far enough to peek around the frame. And there it was, sitting in the middle of the yard, staring up at her. Still. Watching. Waiting. But now it looked different. Its fur was matted, damp, like it had been crawling through the earth. Its mouth hung open, just slightly, revealing too many teeth. Emily's pulse roared in her ears. She staggered back from the window. Her foot caught on the edge of the rug. She stumbled. For a split second, she saw the world tilt. Then, something moved. Not the dog. Something behind it. Tall. Shadowed. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Then, just as quickly, gone. Emily clamped a hand over her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. She turned, ready to run, to get out of the house, to wake up from whatever this was. And then she saw it. The door. Wide open. The cold air creeping in, curling around her bare feet. And just beyond the threshold, a single wet footprint. Not human. Not Mark's. A deep, clawed imprint in the wood. Then, a whisper, right behind her. You left the door unlocked, Emily. Emily's breath hitched. The whisper was so close, right behind her, curling against her ear like a breath she couldn't feel. She spun around. Nothing. The door stood open, the night yawning beyond it, dark and endless. Her pulse pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, to find Mark. But her body wouldn't move. Then, the floor creaked. Not from her. From somewhere inside the house. Slow. Deliberate. Emily clenched her jaw, swallowing a cry as she turned toward the hallway. Shadows stretched long against the walls, flickering in the dim light. Another creak. Closer. Emily backed away. Her hands fumbled for the door, for the knob, for anything. Then, a low, wet sound. Breathing. Right behind her. She felt it before she heard it. The slow, dragging inhale. The rasping exhale. Like something just now realizing it had found her. Emily's body jerked into action. She bolted for the stairs. Her bare feet pounded against the wood as she flew up, taking the steps two at a time. The breath followed. Closer. A thump echoed behind her, something dropping to the floor. Scraping, claws dragging. She didn't look back. Couldn't. She lunged into the bedroom, throwing herself against the door. Slammed it shut. Locked it. The silence stretched. Emily's breaths came in ragged, uneven bursts. Then, thump. Something heavy pressed against the door. Not knocking. Just leaning. Waiting. Emily backed away, shaking. Then, the whisper. You forgot about Mark. Her stomach turned. She hadn't forgotten. She couldn't. Mark was out there. Somewhere. And if she stayed here, if she waited, she might never see him again. The whisper came again, softer this time. Come see the dog, Emily. Her hands clenched into fists. No. She wouldn't listen. She had to find Mark. Emily took a shaky breath. Then, she reached for the window and climbed outside. The cold night air hit Emily like a slap. Her bare feet landed softly on the roof, just outside the bedroom window. The shingles were rough, biting against her skin as she steadied herself. Her breath puffed in white clouds. The world below was too quiet. She crouched low, moving carefully along the slanted roof, eyes locked on the yard. The dog was still there, sitting, watching, but now its head was tilted back, eyes locked directly onto her. And it was smiling. Emily's stomach twisted. The thing inside that dog wasn't right. It wasn't alive, and it wasn't alone. A shadow moved in the darkness, low to the ground, crawling. Emily bit down on a gasp. Something was slithering across the lawn, its shape stretching, limbs bending at wrong angles. It was heading toward the house, heading toward the front door. Her heart hammered. She had to move. Now. She crawled toward the edge of the roof, glancing down. The porch was just below her. It wasn't too far of a drop. She could make it. She had to. Emily swung her legs over the edge. Then, a sound, a whisper, right beside her. Emily. She whipped her head around and saw him. Mark. He was standing on the roof with her. But something was wrong. His clothes were dirty, damp. His skin was too pale. His eyes, they weren't his. They were dark, hollow. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. Come see the dog, Emily. Her chest squeezed. That wasn't Mark. It wasn't him. She let go. The fall was quick, jarring, her body hitting the porch hard. Pain shot through her legs, but she didn't stop, didn't hesitate. She ran. Down the steps. Across the yard. The dog never moved. The thing crawling through the grass never looked up. She bolted toward the neighbor's house. Her fists pounded against the front door. Mr. Green! Open the door. Silence. Her breath came in sharp, panicked bursts. Then, a soft click. The door swung open. Mr. Green stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something close to fear. You saw it, didn't you? He whispered. Emily swallowed hard. What is it? She choked out. Mr. Green's expression darkened. He exhaled slowly. And then he said, It wants to come inside. Emily's breath hitched. The words felt like ice slipping down her spine. It wants to come inside. Mr. Green's grip on the door tightened, his knuckles white. His eyes darted past her, scanning the yard, searching the darkness. You shouldn't have looked at it. His voice was barely above a whisper. Emily swallowed hard. What is it? Mr. Green shook his head. Not here. Come inside. Now. Emily hesitated. Somewhere behind her, the grass rustled. Soft. Slow. Like something was shifting, moving closer. She turned. The dog was gone. The yard was empty. But the air felt wrong. Heavy. Waiting. Emily's legs moved on their own, pushing her across the threshold. Mr. Green slammed the door shut behind her. Locked it. Dead silence filled the house. The old man stood still for a long moment, his hand still on the lock. His breathing was unsteady. Then, you need to tell me exactly what you saw. Emily clenched her fists. Her heart was still hammering. The dog, she whispered. It was staring at us. Every night. And tonight. Her throat tightened. It smiled at me. Mr. Green's expression didn't change. He just nodded, like he already knew, like he had been expecting this. And the boy, he asked. Did you see him? Emily stiffened. Her mouth went dry. What boy? The old man's gaze sharpened. The one that looks like your husband. A chill spread through her body. Emily took a step back. That wasn't Mark. No. Mr. Green's voice was firm. It wasn't. He turned, moving deeper into the house. Emily followed, her mind racing, her skin crawling. The living room was dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture and stacks of dusty books. But something was off. Emily saw them before anything else. The photographs. Framed pictures lined the walls, filling every inch of space. But none of them were normal. They were all of the dog. In every single one, the same black-furred, empty-eyed dog sat in different places, on the porch, by the trees, in the middle of the road, always staring. Emily's stomach twisted. What is this? She whispered. Mr. Green didn't look at her. Proof. He grabbed one of the frames, gripping it tight. You were never supposed to see it. You were never supposed to notice. Emily's blood ran cold. What do you mean? The old man exhaled. Then he looked at her. Because once you notice it, his voice dropped. It notices you. Emily's breath caught. Then, a sound. A scratching. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the front door. They weren't alone. The scratching at the door was slow. Deliberate. Like claws dragging across the wood. Emily's body went rigid. Don't move, Mr. Green whispered. His voice was barely audible, like speaking too loud might invite something in. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed against the walls, heavy and suffocating. Emily's breath came in short, shaky bursts. Then, a soft, wet sniffing, right against the door. Her stomach twisted. It was smelling for them. She turned to Mr. Green, her pulse hammering. What does it want? The old man's face was grim. It wants to be let in, he said. It's always wanted that. A chill crawled down Emily's spine. She could hear it breathing. Low, hollow, wrong. Then, a voice. Emily. Her heart nearly stopped. It was Mark's voice. Muffled, weak. Emily opened the door. She took a step back, shaking her head. No, that's not him. Mr. Green stayed still, his jaw clenched tight. Don't answer it. Emily, please. The voice was trembling now. Desperate. It hurts. Let me in. Her hands curled into fists. It sounded like Mark. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't him. It was something else. Something wearing his voice. Stay quiet, Mr. Green whispered. It's trying to trick you. Emily pressed her lips together, forcing herself to stay silent. The breathing on the other side of the door grew heavier. Then, a soft click. Her blood ran cold. The doorknob was turning. Slowly. It can't come in unless we let it, Mr. Green murmured. The knob twisted back and forth, rattling against the lock. Then, the scratching started again. But this time it was higher, moving up the door. Emily's chest tightened. It wasn't using its claws anymore. It was using fingers. Long, scraping fingers. Then, the whispering started. Low, hushed voices. Too many voices, overlapping, seeping through the wood. Mark's voice. Her own voice. Soft and pleading. Let me in. Please, Emily. I'm so cold. Her breath hitched. It knew her name. It was mimicking her. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to listen. Mr. Green took a slow step back. It's not going to stop, he murmured. She turned to him, panic rising in her throat. Then what do we do? He swallowed hard. Then, for the first time, he looked afraid. We wait. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. We wait, she whispered, her voice trembling. For what? Mr. Green didn't answer. The whispers at the door grew softer, fading into something worse. Laughter. Low. Breathless. A dozen voices giggling from the other side. Emily felt sick. She backed away, her hands shaking. "We can't just stand here." Mr. Green's gaze was locked on the door. "If we acknowledge it, it grows stronger. If we react, it learns." Emily pressed her hands over her ears. The laughter was inside her head. It was twisting, shifting, changing, turning into her son's voice. "Mommy," her breath caught. "Mommy, please open the door." Her knees nearly buckled. Her son was upstairs, asleep, safe. This wasn't real. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to stay still. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. The entire door shuddered. Then, it stopped. Dead silence. The kind that felt wrong. Like the air itself was holding its breath. Emily risked a glance at Mr. Green. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking at the window. Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned, and she saw it. The dog. Or at least something that looked like the dog. It was outside, pressed against the glass, its head tilted unnaturally. It's empty, black eyes locked onto hers. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just smiled. Wide. Too wide. Like its skin was stretching to hold it. Emily's entire body seized with fear. The lights flickered. The house groaned. Mr. Green's voice was barely a whisper. "Do not look away." Emily's breath shuddered out. The dog's mouth moved. "Let me in." The words weren't spoken. They didn't come from the glass. They came from inside her own head. Her throat tightened. She could feel it in her mind. Digging. Crawling. "It knows you see it," Mr. Green murmured. The dog's head tilted further, the bones in its neck cracking. "It won't leave now." The words sent a spike of terror through her. Emily's hands clenched. "Then what do we do?" Mr. Green's gaze was steady. "We survived the night." Then, the window shattered, and everything went dark. Emily barely had time to scream before the lights cut out completely. Glass rained down in sharp, glittering shards as the window shattered inward. The wind howled through the broken space, but there was something else underneath it. A low, rasping breath. Emily stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy, pressing down on her chest like something unseen was wrapping around her lungs. "Stay close," Mr. Green said. His voice was steady, but his grip on her arm was tight. The thing outside didn't move immediately. It lingered, just beyond the broken window, its shape shifting in the darkness. Emily's breath hitched. The outline of the dog was still there, but it wasn't right. Its legs were too long, its body too thin. It was staring at them with that same impossibly wide grin. Then in one slow, jerking motion, it climbed through the window. Not jumped, not crawled. It slid, its body twisting unnaturally over the shattered frame, bones popping and shifting like they were breaking and resetting all at once. Emily couldn't move. "Close your eyes," Mr. Green whispered. She wanted to. She tried to. But she couldn't. She was stuck, paralyzed by those empty, bottomless eyes. The thing's mouth opened, too wide. Its jaw stretched, skin splitting at the corners. "You let me in," it said. Its voice was thick and wet, like something speaking through a mouth full of water. Emily's stomach turned. "We didn't," Mr. Green said. His voice was firm, but his hands were shaking. "You forced your way in. That's not the same." The thing laughed, a garbled, broken sound that made Emily's skin crawl. Then, it took a step forward. Mr. Green shoved Emily back. "Go. Now." She didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran. The house was a maze of shadows, the storm outside throwing jagged flashes of light across the walls. Her feet barely touched the floor as she sprinted toward the stairs. "Mark!" she screamed. She had to get to her son. Behind her, the thing moved. Not footsteps. Something scraping, dragging, like claws against wood. Mr. Green was behind her, his breath ragged. "Get upstairs. Lock the door." Emily didn't stop. She reached the top of the stairs and bolted down the hallway. Mark's room. Her hands fumbled with the doorknob, heart hammering. She threw the door open and slammed it shut behind her, locking it in one quick motion. "Mark!" She turned and froze. Mark was sitting up in bed. His wide, sleepy eyes stared at her. "Mommy!" Relief flooded her chest. She rushed forward, grabbing him, pulling him into her arms. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here." She could still hear the thing downstairs. The groan of floorboards. The soft, slow breathing. She swallowed hard and pulled Mark close. Then, Mark giggled. A small, breathy sound. Emily stiffened. Slowly, she pulled back to look at him. His face was still sleepy, but his mouth, his lips were curling, stretching, into a too-wide smile. Emily's blood turned to ice. "You let me in," he whispered. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stared at Mark, at his too-wide grin, at the way his small body sat unnaturally still in her arms. "No," she whispered. Mark tilted his head. "You let me in," he said again. His voice was light, playful, but underneath it, there was something else. A second voice layered beneath his own. Wet, hollow, wrong. Emily yanked her hands away as if burned, scrambling backward. This wasn't Mark. It looked like him, but something inside her screamed that it wasn't. "Mark, baby, wake up," she pleaded. "Please." But Mark only blinked at her. His head tilted the other way. His grin widened. Behind her, something thumped against the door. Once, twice, slow, deliberate. Emily's heart pounded as she turned toward the noise. "Emily," Mr. Green's voice. But it wasn't right. It was thick, like something struggling to use his vocal cords properly. The door handle rattled. "Emily," the voice repeated. "You let me in. Open the door." Emily clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. "What do you want?" she whispered. Mark laughed. Her head snapped back to him. "We were lonely," he said. "You saw us. You let us in. And now we're staying." His voice shifted on the last word, deeper, guttural. Emily stumbled backward. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A sharp click made her flinch. The lock. It was turning. She hadn't touched it. The door creaked open, and standing in the doorway was Mark. Her real Mark. His hair was damp from sweat, his cheeks flushed with sleep. He rubbed his eyes, yawning. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emily's stomach dropped. She whirled around. The other Mark was still on the bed, still grinning. The thing in the doorway took a slow step forward. "Mom," her real son's voice. "Who's that?" Emily's blood ran cold. The Mark in the bed sat up straighter, his head twisted unnaturally far to one side, his smile never faltering. "Mommy," he said, "come sit with me." Emily backed away. Her real son was behind her. The thing was in front of her, and somewhere in the house, Mr. Green, or whatever was left of him, was still moving. The walls groaned. The air pressed against her skin. She had to do something. She had to run. She grabbed Mark's wrist and yanked. "Come on." Mark barely had time to react before she was dragging him down the hall. The thing in his room didn't chase them. It didn't have to. It just watched. Its wide, grinning face the last thing she saw before she slammed the door behind her. Emily ran. She didn't think. Didn't stop. She just yanked Mark along, their feet pounding against the floor as they rushed down the hallway. Behind them, the house groaned. The walls shuddered. The air thickened, pressing against her skin like unseen hands trying to hold her back. "Mom, what's happening?" Mark cried. "Don't stop." Emily gasped. They hit the stairs hard, nearly tumbling down them. The shadows stretched, shifted. A shape moved at the bottom of the staircase. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. Mr. Green, or what was left of him. His head hung at an odd angle, his jaw slack. His skin was gray, waxy. And his eyes, oh God, his eyes were gone. Nothing but hollow sockets, dark and endless. "You let us in," Mr. Green rasped. The voice was layered, just like before. Emily gripped Mark tighter. "Stay behind me," she whispered. Mr. Green took a step forward. Emily took a step back. She felt something shift behind her. A slow creak. The sensation of eyes watching. The other Mark. Still upstairs. Still waiting. They were trapped. Mark whimpered. "Mom." Emily's breath came fast. Her mind raced. She thought of the Greens' house. Of the locked doors. The empty rooms. The dog. They hadn't let something in. They had been trying to keep something out. But Emily had ruined that. She had let it in. She sucked in a sharp breath. "We need to leave." Mr. Green grinned, too wide. "You can't." Emily's stomach twisted. The walls shuddered. A terrible, deep noise vibrated through the house. A sound like something enormous waking from a long, long sleep. Then, the front door swung open. A gust of cold air rushed in. For the briefest moment, the house hesitated. The wrongness flickered, like a radio struggling to hold onto a signal. Emily didn't waste time. She grabbed Mark and ran. She shoved past Mr. Green's hulking form, ignoring the way his skin moved beneath his clothes. They hit the porch, the street. The cold air burned her lungs. She ran until her legs gave out, until she collapsed on the sidewalk, pulling Mark against her. The house loomed behind them, silent, watching, and then the front door slammed shut, like it had never been open at all. Emily sat frozen on the cold pavement, clutching Mark against her chest. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to look up, back at the house. It was dark now, silent. The windows reflected nothing but the night. No shapes, no movement, no staring dog, just a house. Mark trembled in her arms. "Mom, what was that?" She had no answer. Her gaze drifted to the Greens' house. The windows there were dark too. The whole street was still, like nothing had ever happened, like the nightmare hadn't just chased them out. She swallowed hard and forced herself onto shaky legs. "Come on, baby. We're going home." Mark nodded weakly. They walked in silence, their own house only a few doors down. But even as they stepped inside and locked the door, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She peered out the window one last time. Everything looked normal. The street, the houses. But then, her breath caught. A light flickered on in the Greens' upstairs window. A shadow shifted behind the curtain. A shape. Tall. Still. Watching. Emily's stomach dropped. Not the dog. A man. Someone or something staring right at her. And even from across the street, she could swear it was smiling. She yanked the curtains shut. Turned off the lights. Held Mark close as he drifted into uneasy sleep. But she didn't sleep. She just lay there in the dark, listening. And waiting. Because deep down she knew. The wrong neighbor's dog had only been the beginning. Let's start with the next story. Ryan sat on his couch, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. It was late, past midnight, but he wasn't tired. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. Then his phone buzzed. A voicemail. He frowned. He hadn't heard it ring. He checked the screen. No missed calls, just a notification, one new voicemail. Ryan hesitated before tapping on it. The number on the screen made his breath hitch. It was his own. That's not possible. A chill crawled up his spine. A glitch, maybe? He shook his head and pressed play. At first, there was only static. A deep, hissing sound that made his skin prickle. Then, beneath the noise, something shifted. A voice. His voice. At first, it was faint, like a whisper buried under layers of distortion. Then it grew louder. More frantic. Ryan heard himself scream. Get out of the house. The voicemail cut off. Silence. Ryan's hand trembled as he lowered the phone. His own voice, raw with panic, still echoed in his head. He swallowed hard and glanced around his apartment. Nothing seemed out of place. The door was locked. The windows were shut. Everything was exactly as it should be. It's a prank. Has to be. But how? His phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. The same number. Ryan's breath came fast. He didn't want to listen, but his fingers moved on their own. He pressed play. Static again. Then the voice. His voice. But this time it was closer. Ryan heard himself breathing heavily, like he was running. Then another scream. Get out now. Then silence. Ryan's blood turned to ice. He bolted upright, his heart hammering. His eyes darted around the room, searching for what? An intruder? A hidden speaker? Then his phone rang. The screen glowed in the dim room. The caller ID read, unknown number. Ryan hesitated, then answered with a shaky voice. Hello? Nothing. Just static. Then his own voice whispering. It's already inside. The line went dead. Ryan dropped the phone. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned slowly, his ears straining for any sound. Somewhere behind him, the floor creaked. Something was in the house. Ryan's body went rigid. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but he couldn't. His eyes stayed locked on the dark hallway leading to his bedroom. The air in the apartment felt heavier now, pressing against his skin like a thick, invisible fog. Another creak. It came from the bedroom. Ryan swallowed hard. No, I locked the door. The windows are shut. His thoughts were racing, trying to grasp at some kind of logic. His phone vibrated in his shaking hands. Another voicemail. Ryan didn't want to listen, but his finger moved on its own, tapping play. This time, there was no static, just deep, ragged breathing. Then his voice, barely above a whisper. It knows you can hear it. Ryan's breath hitched. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. A shadow shifted in the hallway. His stomach twisted into knots. He wasn't alone. The floor groaned as if something heavy was moving toward him. Slow, deliberate steps. Ryan forced himself to move. He grabbed the nearest object, a glass from the coffee table, and hurled it at the hallway. It shattered against the wall. The sound echoed through the apartment, but whatever was in the hallway didn't stop. The steps kept coming. Ryan bolted. He ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock. His hands were slick with sweat, slipping as he twisted the deadbolt. He yanked the door open. The hallway outside was empty. Cold air rushed past him as he stepped into the dimly lit corridor. The fluorescent light flickered above him, casting long, jittery shadows on the floor. Ryan turned back toward his apartment. The door was still open. The darkness inside looked deeper, almost unnatural, like it was swallowing the light from the hallway. His phone vibrated again. He looked down. Another voicemail. His stomach churned as he pressed play. This time, the voice wasn't screaming. It was laughing. A low, distorted chuckle, layered with static, like multiple voices laughing over each other. Then, in a voice that was almost his own, it whispered, "You can't run." Ryan's breath hitched. A chill crawled up his spine as he realized. The apartment door was slowly closing. He hadn't touched it. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears as the apartment door creaked shut. He had seconds, maybe less, before he'd be locked out. Or worse, locked in. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the door just before it clicked into place. His fingers dug into the wood, heart hammering as he forced it open again. A blast of cold air hit him from inside. The apartment wasn't just dark anymore. It felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. The shadows in the hallway stretched unnaturally, as if something was lurking just beyond sight. His phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Ryan's hands shook as he raised the phone, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't want to hear it. He shouldn't hear it. but his thumb pressed play. A distorted voice whispered, "You let it out." Ryan staggered back, his stomach twisting. He turned sharply, his only thought now to get out, to put as much distance between himself and whatever had invaded his home. He sprinted down the hallway, his footsteps slapping against the floor. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting strange, jittery shadows along the walls. Another voicemail. His phone vibrated violently in his pocket, as if demanding his attention. Ryan ignored it. He reached the stairwell and bolted down the steps 2 at a time. He needed to get outside, into the open air, away from the creeping darkness of the apartment. But as he reached the lobby, something felt off. The front doors stood open, revealing the night outside. The street beyond was quiet. Too quiet. Ryan slowed his steps. Something was wrong. The city was silent. No cars. No wind. No distant hum of life. Just nothing. His phone vibrated again. Another voicemail. With trembling hands, Ryan pressed play. This time, it was his own voice. Calm. Flat. Wrong. Turn around. Ryan froze. A breath ghosted against the back of his neck. Something was behind him. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head, and the lights in the lobby cut out. Everything plunged into darkness. The phone slipped from his fingers. And then, a whisper right next to his ear. You shouldn't have listened. Ryan's breath hitched in his throat. The darkness around him wasn't normal. It felt alive, pressing against his skin like a suffocating shroud. The silence stretched, heavy and endless, broken only by the faint drip, drip, drip of something unseen. His phone, lying on the cold floor, vibrated again. Another voicemail. The glow from the screen cast eerie shadows across his trembling hands as he bent down to pick it up. The number flashing across the screen was his own. He swallowed hard, hesitating. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave the phone behind and bolt for the door. But his fingers moved on their own. He pressed play. At first, it was static. Then, beneath the crackling distortion, a sound emerged, his own voice, gasping, frantic, filled with sheer, raw terror. Don't move. It's right behind you. Ryan's entire body went rigid. The air around him felt heavier, denser, like the walls of reality were folding in. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breathing shallow and uneven. Something brushed against the back of his neck. A slow, deliberate touch. Cold. Clammy. Ryan's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He ran. He didn't care where, just away. His footsteps echoed unnaturally as he sprinted through the lobby. The open doors loomed ahead, the night beyond impossibly still. He didn't stop to question it. He threw himself through the doorway and slammed into something solid. Pain exploded through his skull as he stumbled backward. He gasped, blinking rapidly, his vision swimming. The doors. They weren't open anymore. They had never been open. The city outside was gone. There was nothing beyond the glass. No street. No sky. Just an endless, yawning void stretching infinitely in all directions. Ryan staggered back, his stomach twisting with nausea. His head swam with dizziness. His phone vibrated again. Slowly, as if in a trance, he lifted it to his ear. A voice low, rasping, almost familiar. You never left, Ryan. His knees buckled. The voicemail wasn't a warning. It was a memory. And he was still trapped. Ryan's mind reeled. His breathing turned ragged as he backed away from the locked doors, his pulse hammering so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. This isn't real. It can't be real. But the weight of the phone in his hand was real. The cold sweat clinging to his skin was real. And the voice on the voicemail, it was his. You never left, Ryan. He turned sharply, scanning the dim lobby. It looked different now. The walls stretched taller, impossibly high, their surfaces warped like melting wax. The once polished floor was cracked, dark lines splitting through the marble like veins. His reflection in the glass doors twisted. His own face, but wrong. The mouth slightly open. lips moving, though he wasn't speaking. Ryan's hands clenched. "Let me out," his reflection mouthed. A sharp pain lanced through his skull. His knees wobbled, and he clutched his head as a wave of nausea rolled over him. Whispers slithered through the air, low, unintelligible murmurs, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The phone buzzed violently in his grip. Another voicemail. Shaking, he lifted it, barely able to steady his fingers enough to press play. More static, a deep crackling hum. Then, "Turn around." Ryan choked on a gasp. "No." He squeezed his eyes shut, every nerve screaming against it. He felt the presence behind him. The air had shifted, thick with something heavy and unseen. The scent of damp earth and something rotting curled into his nostrils. A voice, inches from his ear. "Ryan." His body snapped into motion before his brain fully processed what was happening. He bolted, his footsteps slamming against the distorted floor as he ran blindly, deeper into the building. Doors blurred past him, flickering in and out of existence. Corridors stretched, narrowed, then shifted entirely. The lobby was gone, the building expanding, rearranging itself like a living thing. His phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Ryan forced himself to keep running, but his thumb moved on instinct. Static. A deep inhale. Then, his own voice, weak and broken. "You can't escape." His stomach clenched. The hallway in front of him twisted violently, walls bending inward. A door materialized at the very end. Unlike the others, it didn't flicker. It was solid, real. A way out. Ryan sprinted toward it, lungs burning. His fingers stretched, reaching. The door vanished. The hallway plunged into absolute darkness. His phone buzzed. Another voicemail. A single word. "Run." Ryan's breath hitched. His pulse roared in his ears as the darkness swallowed everything. His hands groped blindly, searching for the walls, the floor, anything to ground himself. But there was nothing. No walls. No ceiling. No floor. Just the heavy, suffocating blackness pressing in on all sides. Then his phone buzzed again. The screen was the only thing visible in the void, casting a weak glow onto his trembling fingers. Another voicemail. Ryan hesitated, his thumb hovering over the play button. His entire body screamed against it, but he had no choice. He had to listen. He pressed play. Static. A faint hum. Then his own voice, whispering. "It's behind you." Ryan's stomach lurched. A cold breath slid down his neck. He spun around. A shape loomed in the dark, just beyond the glow of his phone. A silhouette, impossibly tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but Ryan felt it watching him. His breath came in short gasps, his body frozen in place. The figure stood motionless, but the darkness around it seemed to pulse like it was alive. Then his phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. His own voice, urgent, panicked. "Don't let it touch you." Ryan stumbled backward. The void beneath him shifted, warping like liquid. His phone flickered. The glow dimmed. The figure stepped forward. Ryan screamed. He turned and ran, though he wasn't sure if he was running at all. The ground felt unstable, shifting beneath his feet like a dream. His surroundings blurred, the dark stretching and bending around him. His phone vibrated. Another voicemail. He didn't want to listen, but his shaking hand lifted the phone anyway. Static. Then his voice, desperate. "You have to remember. Ryan, remember." Remember what? His legs weakened. His lungs burned. His mind scrambled for something. Anything that made sense. The building. The elevator. The call. He had answered his own number. He had heard himself screaming. And now, Ryan skidded to a stop. The darkness ahead of him had shifted, revealing something new. A door. Not just any door. His apartment door. Number 306. His chest rose and fell in heavy gasps. The doorknob gleamed under the dim glow of his phone, untouched, waiting. His phone buzzed. A final voicemail. His own voice steady. "Open the door, Ryan. It's the only way out." Ryan stared at the door, his breath ragged. His own voice had told him to open it. But could he trust it? His phone trembled in his grip. The glow of the screen flickered, growing weaker, as if the battery were draining faster than it should. The void behind him seemed to tighten, pressing in like a living thing, urging him forward. He swallowed hard. His fingers wrapped around the doorknob. It was warm. Ryan's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure why, but the warmth felt wrong. His apartment should be empty. The metal should be cold. A whisper slithered through the dark. "Ryan." His spine went rigid. It hadn't come from the phone. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head. The figure stood inches away. Ryan gasped, stumbling forward, shoving the door open. Light exploded around him. His ears popped. A ringing sound filled his head, deafening, unbearable. He stumbled through the doorway, his vision blurring. And then, he was back. The door slammed shut behind him. Ryan stood in his apartment, the familiar scent of old wood and coffee filling his nostrils. His breath came in uneven gasps. His phone was still clutched in his hand, but the screen was blank now. No messages, no missed calls. He turned, staring at his front door. His hands trembled as he reached for the knob and yanked it open. The hallway was there, the same dimly lit corridor of his apartment building. No void, no endless darkness. Ryan let out a shaky breath. It was over, or so he thought. His phone vibrated. Slowly he looked down. A single notification blinked on the screen. New voicemail. His throat tightened. His thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating. Then, almost against his will, he pressed play. The message crackled to life. Static. A faint hum. Then his own voice, soft, breathless. "Ryan, you never left." His stomach dropped. The lights in his apartment flickered. The air grew heavy, thick, suffocating. And behind him, a shadow stretched across the floor. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. His breath turned shallow as he stared at the shadow stretching toward him, creeping closer with every flicker of the lights. "Ryan, you never left." The voicemail echoed in his mind. His own voice. But he was standing here, wasn't he? He had escaped. He had stepped through the door, back into his apartment. Hadn't he? His fingers twitched, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The shadow behind him grew darker, denser, as if the air itself was thickening. A soft breath brushed against his neck. "Ryan." He spun around. Nothing. The apartment was empty, but the air was wrong. The walls seemed stretched. The ceiling loomed higher than it should. The corners of the room were too dark, swallowing the light like bottomless pits. Ryan backed away. His footstep made no sound. His stomach twisted. His apartment had always creaked, always groaned under his weight. But now silence. His phone vibrated again. New voicemail. Ryan swallowed hard and pressed play. The message was clearer this time. His own voice came through, breathless, panicked. "Ryan, listen to me. You're still inside. You have to go deeper. It's the only way out." Ryan shook his head. His own voice was lying to him. It had to be. A noise crept into the silence. A soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. The blinds were closed, but the shape on the other side was unmistakable. A face, pressed against the glass. Ryan's stomach clenched. The face was his. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His own face stared back at him from the window, pale, wide-eyed, mouth slightly open as if whispering something. The glass warped around it like it wasn't outside, but inside, just beneath the surface, pressing forward. He staggered back, his pulse hammering in his ears. His phone buzzed violently in his hand. Another voicemail. New message. His thumb trembled as he pressed play. This time, the voice was desperate. "Ryan, you're running out of time. You're not real. None of this is real. You need to go deeper. The door, find the door. Static swallowed the rest of the words. Ryan's thoughts twisted in his skull. Not real. The door. What door? Then movement. The reflection of his other self in the window twitched. Its lips pulled into a slow, unnatural grin. Let me in. The blinds snapped open. Ryan screamed. The window was no longer showing the outside world. Instead, it revealed an identical room, his apartment, but empty. Dark. Dead. No furniture. No pictures on the wall. Just an open door at the far end. And a figure standing in the doorway. It was him. His own reflection stepped forward, out of the window, and into the room with him. You shouldn't have answered, the other Ryan said. Ryan stumbled back, his legs shaking, his entire body screaming at him to move, to run. But there was nowhere to go. The apartment had changed. The front door was gone. The walls stretched endlessly into blackness. The other Ryan took another step forward, his head tilting in a way that wasn't human. His smile widened. You have to take my place. Ryan's phone vibrated again. He barely registered the notification. New voicemail. His finger pressed play automatically. A deep, guttural whisper crawled through the speaker. It's too late. The lights flickered. Darkness swallowed the room. A final scream echoed through the empty apartment. Then, silence. The phone clattered to the floor, its screen still glowing. The voicemail icon blinked once, then disappeared. A few moments later, the screen lit up again. New message. A breathless voice whispered through the speaker. Hello? Is anyone there? I think I'm trapped. Please, someone help me. And then, static. Ryan gasped, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He wasn't dead. Not yet. He was standing in the same apartment, or what looked like his apartment. But something was wrong. The walls seemed thinner, stretched, the colors dull, like an old photograph left out in the sun too long. His phone was still in his hand. He stared at the screen. New message. He hesitated. His fingers twitched. Every instinct told him not to press play. But something deeper, something pulling at the edges of his mind, forced him to tap the screen. The voicemail began. Ryan, don't move. His blood ran cold. It can't see you unless you move. His breath caught in his throat. His muscles locked. Then he heard it. A slow, deliberate sound. Tap. 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 Something was in the room with him. He didn't dare look. The voice in the voicemail continued. If you hear the tapping, it's already close. If you see it, don't blink. Whatever you do, don't blink. Ryan's eyes burned. His body trembled. The tapping grew louder. Closer. Tap. 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 His phone buzzed violently in his hand. New message. A choked sob rose in his throat. He pressed play. Static filled his ears, then a voice, his own, screaming. Run! Ryan didn't think. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He bolted forward, toward where the front door should have been. The walls blurred as he ran. The air felt thick, pressing against him like invisible hands trying to slow him down. The tapping turned into footsteps. Heavy. Fast. Something was chasing him. A door appeared ahead, flickering in and out of existence like a glitch in reality. He didn't question it. He reached for the handle. A hand grabbed his wrist. Cold. Wrong. A voice whispered against his ear. You don't get to leave. Ryan screamed. Ryan's scream echoed in the warped space around him. The hand on his wrist tightened, its grip ice cold, burning into his skin like frostbite. He twisted, pulling away with all his strength, but it wouldn't let go. His phone buzzed again. New message. Through his panic, he forced himself to glance at the screen. His own voice crackled through the speaker. You can still escape, but you have to let go. Let go! The words didn't make sense until he realized something. The door ahead of him was flickering because he was flickering. He wasn't fully here. Whatever had grabbed him was trying to keep him in this place. Ryan made a choice. He stopped fighting. He stopped struggling. Instead, he let himself fall. The grip slipped. A terrible shriek filled the air, something inhuman and full of rage. And then, the world snapped back. Ryan hit the floor. Hard. He gasped, blinking rapidly. He was lying in the middle of his apartment, his phone clutched in his trembling hand. The air was still. The walls were normal. His reflection in the TV screen looked pale, shaken but whole. The phone buzzed one last time. He looked down. No new messages. His call log was empty. His voicemail was empty. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Ryan sat there for a long time, his heart hammering. The silence felt wrong, like a trick. He forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady, and walked to the front door. He opened it. The hallway outside was empty. The world looked the same, but deep down, he knew something had changed. Somewhere, in another version of this place, his voice was still screaming. Somewhere, in another version of himself. He never got out. Ryan stood frozen at the doorway, his breath shaky, his heart pounding in his chest. The world outside his apartment looked normal, but something inside him whispered that it wasn't. That the air was too still, that the walls were watching him. He needed to get out. Grabbing his car keys, he bolted down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Every step felt like it stretched longer, as if the building itself was resisting his escape. He forced himself to keep moving. Bursting through the lobby doors, he stepped into the cold night air. He inhaled deeply, trying to convince himself that he was free. But as he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed again. New voicemail. Ryan didn't want to listen, but his hand moved on its own. Static. A deep, suffocating hum. And then, "You shouldn't have left." His own voice. Ryan turned sharply, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot. His reflection in the car window looked back at him. He felt sick. His phone buzzed again. This time, there was no message, just a single word flashing on the screen. "Look." Ryan hesitated. Then slowly he turned around. A figure stood at the entrance of the apartment building. It was him. Ryan, his exact mirror image, stood in the doorway, staring at him with hollow eyes. The reflection of himself raised its hand and waved. Then it stepped back inside. Ryan staggered backward, shaking his head. No, that's not real. His phone buzzed violently in his grip. His shaking fingers lifted it to his ear. His own voice whispered, "You never really left." Ryan's blood ran cold. The parking lot lights flickered. The air became heavy. His limbs felt sluggish. He turned back to his car. The reflection in the window had changed. The version of himself inside the car was grinning. And then, everything went black. Ryan woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing. His eyes shot open. He was sitting on his couch. The room was dim, the air thick with silence. His phone screen lit up. New voicemail. Trembling, he pressed play. The static crackled, then a voice. His own. "Get out of the house." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He turned his head slowly, and saw a shadow standing in the doorway. The call cut off. The lights flickered, and the last thing he heard, before the darkness swallowed him whole, was the sound of his own voice, screaming. Let's start with the next story. The attic was filled with dust and forgotten things. Boxes stacked high, covered in cobwebs. Emily pulled down the chain for the single light bulb, its dim glow barely cutting through the darkness. She had lived in this house for years, but never spent much time up here. It was just storage, a place for things she didn't need, but wasn't ready to throw away. She was looking for an old suitcase when she noticed the wooden chest in the far corner. It wasn't familiar. She didn't remember bringing it up here. It was different from the rest of the boxes, older, its edges worn, and its brass latch rusted. She knelt and ran her fingers over the top, brushing away a thick layer of dust. Emily said, "What are you?" The latch was unlocked. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, was a photo album. The cover was dark leather, cracked with age. The binding was weak, the corners frayed. She picked it up carefully and carried it downstairs. In the living room, she sat on the couch and placed the album on her lap. She ran her hands over the cover again before taking a deep breath and opening it. The first page held a black and white photograph. A family stood in front of a house. The parents were smiling, their arms wrapped around two children, a boy and a girl. They looked happy. Emily frowned. The house in the picture was hers, but the people, she didn't recognize them. She turned the page. More photographs. A birthday party in the backyard, a family dinner at the kitchen table, Christmas morning by the fireplace. They were all taken in her house. The same furniture, the same walls, but the people in the pictures were strangers. Her hands trembled as she flipped further. The family appeared in every photo, always smiling, always happy. But then on one page something changed. The parents were gone. The next few photos only showed the children. In some, they were holding hands. In others, they sat alone, staring directly at the camera. Their smiles had faded. Emily whispered, "Who are you?" She turned another page. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of herself. Not as a child, not in the background, but a recent photo, one she had never taken. She was sitting on her porch, wearing the exact clothes she had on now. Emily dropped the album. Her heart pounded. That wasn't possible. The photo album landed on the floor, flipping to another page. Her eyes were drawn to it. Slowly, she reached down and picked it up. Another picture of her. This time, she was standing at the attic entrance, looking up at the camera. Her hands shook. That picture had been taken from inside the attic. A noise. She gasped and turned her head. The attic door was still open. Something shifted in the darkness above. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The attic door gaped open like a silent mouth, the darkness beyond it thick and unmoving. The house was quiet, but she knew she had heard something. A faint rustling, like fabric shifting against wood. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the album. Her mind raced. Had she left the attic light on? She couldn't remember. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she slowly rose to her feet. Emily whispered, "Hello." No response. She took a cautious step toward the attic stairs, the old wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. The album pressed against her chest as if it had a pulse of its own. She peered up into the attic. The weak bulb still flickered, casting unsteady light over the forgotten objects and shadows that stretched unnaturally long. A deep unease settled in her stomach. She wanted to close the attic door and pretend she had never gone up there, never found the album. But she knew she couldn't. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pull cord. She would turn off the light, close the door, and put the album back where she had found it. But just as her fingers brushed the string, she froze. Another photograph. It lay on the top step, as if someone had placed it there for her to see. Emily's throat tightened. Slowly, she bent down and picked it up. It was a picture of her bedroom. The bed was unmade, the curtains drawn. It looked exactly as she had left it that morning. But she wasn't alone in the picture. A figure stood in the corner of the room. Tall, shadowy, watching. Emily gasped and staggered back, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs. The photograph slipped from her fingers. No, this wasn't real. She turned and ran down the hall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The walls felt closer, the air thick and suffocating. She burst into her bedroom, flipping on the light. Empty. She spun around, scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. Her head pounded. She was seeing things. Maybe she had found an old family's belongings. Maybe there was some logical explanation. Then she saw it. Another photograph. It was on her nightstand, placed neatly on top of her phone. Her blood ran cold as she picked it up. It was another picture of her. This time, she was asleep in her bed, and the figure was standing closer. Let me know when you're ready for the next part. You said, continue with the next part. ChatGPT said. Emily's fingers trembled as she held the photo in her hands. The edges were worn, the paper yellowed with age, but the image itself was crisp and unnervingly clear. There she was, lying in her own bed, her face peaceful in sleep. But behind her, standing at the foot of the bed, was the same shadowy figure. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath came faster, more shallow. She wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in her throat. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. She glanced around the room, as if expecting the figure to materialize from the shadows. Nothing. The room was still, the only sound the frantic thumping of her own heart. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real." But the evidence in her hands told a different story. The photo felt like it was burning her skin, its message unmistakable. She wasn't alone. The figure had been in her room, watching her. She could feel its presence even now, creeping around the edges of her mind. With shaking hands, she dropped the photograph onto the bed, backing away from it as if it might spring to life. She turned toward the door, desperate to leave the room, to get away from the images, the fear. As she moved toward the hallway, her phone buzzed. She froze, her blood running cold. It was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. Should she open it? Her instincts screamed at her to ignore it, to walk away, but something compelled her to reach for the phone. Her finger hovered over the screen. With a deep breath, she tapped it open. The message was brief. "I see you." Her pulse thundered in her ears. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She wasn't imagining this. It was real. Whoever was sending these messages, whoever had left those photos, was watching her. She shoved the phone into her pocket, her mind racing. Her hand reached out to grasp the doorknob, but just before she could turn it, she heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound from the other side of the door. A faint scratching. Her breath caught in her throat again, and she stood still, listening. It was like nails on wood, slow and deliberate, scraping across the door. She turned, her back pressed against the door as she tried to keep quiet, tried to keep still. The scratching continued, growing louder now, moving from the door to the wall. It was as if something, or someone, was walking along the outside of the room. No. She needed to get out. She needed to leave. But as she turned back toward the window, her eyes caught a glimpse of something moving outside. The figure, standing by the edge of the yard, its silhouette barely visible against the night sky. Emily's breath hitched. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding. How had it gotten outside? How did it know where she was? And then, as if the figure had been waiting for her to see it, it turned its head slowly toward her. Its eyes glowed, two small, piercing points of light in the dark. She gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound escaping her lips. The figure began to move toward her. Emily's legs felt like jelly beneath her as she backed away from the window, her mind racing in panic. She could still see the figure moving slowly, deliberately toward the house. Its eyes never left her. She felt as though it could see right through the walls, could see her trembling in the darkness. Her fingers fumbled with the doorknob, but she couldn't bring herself to turn it. The scratching outside had stopped, but now the silence was worse. It was thick, suffocating, and the air in the room felt heavier, as if something was pressing down on her chest. The figure outside had stopped moving, its presence looming just beyond her view. She had to leave, but her body wouldn't obey. Her feet were rooted to the floor, as if an invisible force was holding her in place. The urge to flee was overpowering, but the fear had paralyzed her. Suddenly, the phone in her pocket buzzed again. Emily flinched, her hand instinctively reaching for it. She pulled it out, her fingers shaking uncontrollably as she unlocked it. Another message. "Come outside." It was clear now. Whoever was sending these messages wanted her to go outside, wanted her to come face to face with whatever was waiting for her. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she felt an overwhelming pull, like a magnet, urging her toward the door. It was as if the figure, the messages, everything was pushing her in one direction. Forcing herself to move, Emily reached for the doorknob again. This time she twisted it. The door creaked as it opened, and a gust of cold air rushed into the room. She stepped into the hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The house felt emptier, darker. The walls seemed to close in on her. She didn't want to go outside. She didn't want to face whatever was out there, but she felt trapped, unable to resist the compulsion to move forward. The figure outside was waiting for her, she knew it. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to find a way out. But her legs carried her to the door. As she opened it and stepped into the yard, the cold wind hit her face. The air felt different, heavy, as though the night had thickened. Her eyes scanned the yard. The figure was gone, but she wasn't alone. There, standing just a few feet away, was a figure she recognized. It was herself. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the woman standing in front of her. It was her. There was no mistaking it. But it wasn't the Emily she knew. The woman standing in front of her had hollow eyes, her face twisted in a smile that didn't reach her eyes, as if something had broken inside her long ago. She was pale, too pale, and she wore the same clothes Emily had been wearing when she found the album. What? Emily stammered, her voice trembling. Who are you? The woman, her doppelganger, didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand slowly, pointing toward the house. Emily's gaze followed her finger, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Standing in the doorway of her house was the figure, the shadowy shape. It was watching them both. The woman, her double, turned back to Emily, her smile widening, and whispered in a voice that was eerily calm, "It's waiting for you." Before Emily could respond, the figure outside moved, its shadow growing taller and darker. It began to move toward her, and the closer it came, the more Emily's limbs froze in place. Her body refused to move, paralyzed by the terror that flooded through her. And then from behind her came a whisper, soft, cold, and unmistakable. "You should have never come back." The words echoed in her ears as the figure reached her, its presence now consuming everything in the yard, drowning out the night's sounds. It towered over her, its glowing eyes burning with something dark and ancient. In a low, guttural voice it spoke. "It's time." The figure's words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The coldness in its voice felt like an icy hand gripping her heart. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, pressing down on her chest, making every inhale more difficult than the last. The woman, her doppelganger, still stood there, her expression unreadable. Her pale eyes were fixed on Emily, the faintest flicker of something like recognition, or was it malice, flashing across her face. "You," Emily gasped, her voice barely audible. "You're me. You're me, but you're not." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward, her movement slow and deliberate, as though every step was measured. Emily's legs finally found the strength to move, but they were uncooperative, stiff and trembling, as if they were no longer entirely her own. She stumbled back, her back hitting the cold stone of the house. Her eyes were still locked on the figure that loomed before her, slowly encroaching on her space. It was tall, its form nearly human, but there was something wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. Its eyes gleamed like two burning coals, unsettling in their brightness. A whisper, like wind rustling through dead leaves, escaped from its mouth. It was a language Emily couldn't understand, but it sounded familiar, like the forgotten language of a long-lost time. Suddenly, a thought crashed into her mind, sharp and sudden. The album. The photo album. She had seen this figure there, hadn't she? Yes, she had. One of the photographs in the album had been a faded image of a creature, exactly like the one standing before her. Her breath caught in her throat. The album. The figure's face twisted into something grotesque, its lips curling into a cruel smile. as if it knew exactly what she was thinking. The woman, her double, finally spoke, her voice echoing in the night air, soft but piercing. "You've seen it. You've always known it." Emily's head spun, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She tried to steady herself, but the world around her felt unhinged. It was as if the ground beneath her had softened, her feet sinking into the earth. The figure stepped closer, its towering form bending down toward her. Its eyes burned into her, boring deep into her soul. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. "You are part of it," the figure whispered, its voice now like the hiss of static. "We have waited so long." The ground beneath Emily's feet seemed to vibrate, like the pulse of some hidden power. The woman, her doppelganger, looked at her, her hollow eyes softening for a fraction of a second, as if pitying her. "You shouldn't have come back," the woman said again, her voice distant now, as if she were speaking to herself. "But it's too late." The figure's gaze never left Emily's face as it reached out, one long finger extended. The air around it seemed to ripple, the atmosphere thickening like the silence before a storm. Emily could feel it then, a deep, unnerving connection. The figure, the woman, the album, it was all tied together. Everything. Her memories, her past, her family. The house was part of it too. And the attic, where the photo album had been hiding for so long, was where it all began. The figure's hand was almost on her now, its shadow stretching across her body, its skin impossibly cold against her skin. The air crackled with energy, as if the very earth was holding its breath. And then the voice she had heard in the voicemail, echoed through the air again, louder now, impossibly loud. "Get out of the house." It was her own voice, but distorted. Twisted. The air shimmered, and Emily felt a sudden force rip through her, as though her very essence was being pulled toward the figure. She gasped, but her lungs couldn't seem to fill with air. The woman, her double, turned toward the figure, nodding solemnly. "It's time," she said, and the words seemed to have weight, as if they carried the finality of a fate already decided. Emily tried to speak, to scream, to beg for help, but nothing came out. It was as if her voice had been stolen from her. She could only watch in horror as the figure's fingers closed around her wrist, its touch cold and unyielding. The world seemed to tilt, and the ground disappeared beneath her feet. For the briefest moment, Emily's mind flashed back to the attic, to the photo album, to the pictures she had seen, the faces she didn't recognize. And then it hit her. The people in the photos weren't strangers. They were her family. The album had been a warning. The people in those photos hadn't been dead. Not yet. They had been pulled into this nightmare, just like she was. Just like her family had been before her. The past and present were blending together, and the house was the bridge. The figure pulled her closer, and her vision blurred. Everything around her seemed to dissolve, like a photograph slowly fading away. The house, the yard, the woman, it all started to melt into shadows. And in the distance, through the darkness, she heard a familiar voice. "Emily, it's time to come home." The voice was soft, almost tender, but there was no mistaking the underlying tone of finality. Emily's heart pounded, the sound thundering in her ears as the world around her continued to warp. The figure, her double, still gripped her wrist, its touch sending icy tendrils of fear creeping through her body. "Emily?" The voice echoed again, growing stronger this time, pulling at the very fabric of her reality. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. It felt like it was all around her, inside her mind, in the very air she breathed. The shadows that surrounded her began to twist and bend, coiling like serpents, forming shapes, faces, figures, arms, that reached out, their whispers barely audible over the thunderous beat of her heart. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body was frozen. Her eyes were locked on the figure in front of her, unable to look away. The woman's face, her face, was emotionless, but there was something in the way her eyes glinted, a cruel understanding of something Emily couldn't comprehend. "You're part of it," the figure said again, her voice unnervingly calm. "You always have been. You never left, Emily. You're home now." A wave of dizziness overwhelmed her, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the world seemed to still. Her vision blurred and then refocused, only this time, she was no longer standing outside the house. The attic was before her, and the photo album was open in her hands once again. But the pages were different now, the images changing right before her eyes. She saw the faces of her family, her mother, father, and siblings, each of them younger, but they all looked so different. Their eyes were wide, their expressions frozen in fear. And as she turned the pages, she saw herself in the photographs too, but not as she remembered. She was there, standing among her family, but there was something wrong with her. Her eyes were darker, hollow, and in every picture, something else lurked in the background, a shadowy figure, too indistinct to make out, but always there watching. The air in the attic grew thick, suffocating, and her pulse quickened as the realization hit her. These weren't just old photos, they were memories. Real memories, but they were twisted, distorted, like they had been edited, rewritten, erased, and replaced by something darker. The figures in the photos weren't her family. They were all gone. They had never existed the way she had thought. "Stop it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as her fingers trembled, flipping through the pages faster now. But no matter how fast she turned them, the faces kept changing. Her family was slipping away, becoming something unrecognizable, their smiles fading into distorted masks of terror. The figure's voice spoke again, soft and steady like a lullaby. "You've seen it all. You've always known the truth, Emily. You just had to remember." "No," Emily gasped, her chest tightening as she stumbled backward, still clutching the album in her hands. This isn't real. I don't remember this. I don't remember any of this." But the figure's presence loomed closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It moved like a shadow, slipping through the cracks in reality, its shape distorting with every breath she took. The woman's voice was unyielding, as if carved from stone. "It's not about remembering. It's about accepting. You belong here. You always have." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, blurring her vision. She couldn't stop shaking. She couldn't comprehend what was happening, what this thing, this creature, was telling her. The fear that gripped her heart was suffocating. With a shaky hand, she closed the album, but the images remained, the faces of her family seared into her mind, their eyes pleading with her, begging her to understand. The figure took another step forward, its presence looming over her like an overwhelming storm. I can't stay here," Emily choked out, her voice trembling as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in on her, the room shrinking, the air growing heavier by the second. "Leave," the figure crooned, tilting its head in a mocking gesture. "You never left, Emily. This place never let you go." Emily's heart lurched in her chest as a cold, unyielding truth began to settle into her bones. The house wasn't just a building. It was something older, something more sinister. It had been waiting for her to return, and now that she was here, it would never let her leave. The whispering around her grew louder, the voices of her family, the strange shapes in the shadows. They were all calling to her, reaching for her, trying to pull her into their world, into the place that existed beyond the confines of the house. It was too much. She couldn't take it anymore. She tried to break free, but the shadows wrapped around her, pulling her back into the darkness. Suddenly, a sharp, deafening crack rang through the air. The figure's twisted smile faltered, and the world around Emily seemed to shudder, like the foundation of reality itself was breaking apart. For a split second, she thought she saw something different, something familiar. Her mother's face, her father's voice, calling to her, pleading with her to run. "Get out of the house," the voice echoed again, but it wasn't the figure anymore. It wasn't distorted. It was the voice of her father, clear and urgent. But it was too late. The shadows tightened, and Emily felt herself being pulled deeper into the void. The photo album slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud as the room around her disappeared, leaving only darkness. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of her consciousness, the album's pages turned once more. But this time, Emily was no longer a part of it. She was just a memory. The photos in the album felt like they were closing in on her. Every time she tried to focus, the faces of the people in the pictures seemed to shift, almost as if they were changing when she wasn't looking directly at them. It was unnerving, but as the day wore on, she tried to push the unease aside. She tucked the album under her arm and went downstairs, her footsteps heavy with the weight of the unsettling thoughts swirling in her mind. She decided that if she couldn't get answers from the album itself, maybe she could get them from someone who might know the family better. The next day, she visited her parents, hoping to confront them about the album. When she sat down at the kitchen table, the album resting in front of her, her mother eyed it with suspicion, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Where did you find that?" her mother asked, her voice suddenly distant. "In the attic," the woman replied, placing the album on the table. It was tucked away in a box with some old things. "Mom, who are these people? Why are they in these photos? I recognize me, but no one else." Her mother didn't answer right away. Her eyes flickered between the album and her daughter, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her tone low. "You shouldn't be looking at that. You don't remember them, do you?" "No," the woman said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I don't remember anyone in those photos except myself." "Who are they?" Her mother's face hardened, her hands trembling as she slowly closed the album. "You were very young when they left us. You don't remember because we had to forget. For your safety, for all of our safety." "What do you mean?" The woman's heart began to race. "What happened to them?" Her mother looked away, not answering, but the silence between them spoke volumes. "I can't tell you everything," she finally said, "but those people are gone now, and they shouldn't be remembered." The woman felt a chill creeping up her spine. She tried to grasp for any details, any fragments of memory that might have connected the dots. But everything was blank, empty. Her mind swirled with unanswered questions. "Why are you hiding this from me? What do you mean they're gone?" Her mother stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We didn't want you to remember. It's too dangerous. You're not ready." "Ready for what?" the woman demanded. "What's so dangerous about this album?" Her mother's face was pale, and she looked as though she was about to break. "You have to leave it alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The people in those photos, they were never meant to be in your life. They're connected to something darker, something that we've tried to keep hidden. You need to forget them, just like we did." The woman felt her stomach drop. "You're not making any sense. What did they want?" Her mother stepped back, shaking her head, her hands held up as if to ward off the question. "I can't say more." She turned away, her face ashen. "Just leave it. For your own good, forget everything about them." But the woman couldn't let go of the nagging curiosity gnawing at her. What had her mother meant by too dangerous? She couldn't stop herself from asking more questions, but her mother refused to speak further. Finally, the woman left, the album still in hand. That night, unable to shake the eerie feeling the album had given her, the woman sat in her bedroom, staring at the photos once more. Each picture seemed to breathe with life, each face taking on a haunting, almost menacing quality. She couldn't help but wonder how they had all slipped from her memory. What had her mother kept hidden from her? And why, after all these years, had the past come rushing back in such a terrifying way? Her hands trembling, she opened the album again, flipping through the pages, her eyes narrowing at each new image. And then, as she reached the final photo, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the corner of the picture, she could see her own face, young and innocent, but with a figure standing just behind her. She hadn't noticed the figure before. Now it was impossible to ignore. A tall, shadowy figure, partially obscured by darkness, looming behind her. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, like pale lanterns in the night. She could feel her pulse quicken as she stared at the face. It looked familiar, too familiar. It was her own face, but not the face she knew. The face of a version of herself that she had never seen before, a face twisted with malice, as though something had taken over her, forcing her to look back at herself as a stranger. A version of herself that was no longer human. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an oppressive presence. The woman stared at the photo, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hand reached out, trembling as her fingers hovered over the image. The figure behind her, the one with her own face, seemed to shift slightly, as if it were trying to reach out from the page, pulling her into some nightmare she could not escape. "No, this isn't real," she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself that her mind was playing tricks. But deep down, a chill settled in her bones, and she knew it wasn't just her imagination. She closed the album abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She sat there for a long time, staring at the closed album, unable to bring herself to open it again. The shadows in the room grew longer, and she felt as though something was waiting for her, just out of sight, watching her every move. After what felt like hours, she finally stood up, determination flooding her. She had to confront whatever this was. Whatever was connected to those photos, she had to know the truth. She needed answers, no matter the cost. The next morning, she went to the local library, hoping to find something that could explain the strange history behind her family, behind those faces in the album. She scoured old newspapers, public records, and town archives. She couldn't find much, but then, as she flipped through an old binder of photographs, a certain image caught her eye. There it was, the same family, the faces in the photo. But this time, it wasn't her face she saw. It was someone else, standing next to the others. The person in the photo was smiling, but their eyes were black. There was an eerie stillness to them, something unsettling about their expression. And written beneath it, in fading ink, was a name. The Sinclair family. Her heart stopped. The name was familiar. She had heard it before in passing, but she never thought much of it. She stared at the photo in disbelief. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be part of her family. But the evidence was undeniable. This photo, this family, was real. A chill ran through her spine. She turned to the librarian, her voice shaking as she asked, "Do you know anything about the Sinclair family?" The librarian's eyes widened, her lips pressing into a tight line. She hesitated for a moment before leaning forward, lowering her voice. "Don't speak their name aloud," she whispered, glancing nervously around the room. "It's better not to know." The woman's pulse quickened. "Why?" she demanded. "What happened to them?" The librarian stood up abruptly, the fear evident on her face. "You need to leave. Now. Forget this name. Forget this family. It's too late for them, and it will be too late for you too if you keep digging. Trust me." The warning echoed in her mind as she left the library in a daze, her thoughts spinning. She had to know more. There was no turning back now. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her eyes flickered nervously to the windows, the shadows outside stretching unnaturally long, as if reaching toward her. She had tried to push the thoughts of the Sinclair family out of her mind, but the more she tried, the more they haunted her. The photos, the name, the librarian's warning. She returned home, feeling more anxious with each step. Her hands shook as she opened the attic door again. There, sitting innocently in the corner, was the photo album, the very album that had started it all. She stared at it for a moment, as though it were daring her to open it once more. With a deep breath, she walked over, slowly pulling the album from the shelf. The room seemed colder than before, the silence suffocating. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to face it. Opening the album, her fingers traced the familiar pages, but this time, there was something different. The photos were changing before her eyes. The figures in the pictures, those unfamiliar faces, started to shift. Their eyes began to follow her movements, their smiles stretching wider. The images seemed alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that made her blood run cold. Suddenly she froze. In one of the photos, she saw herself again, but this time, she wasn't standing in front of the family. She was in the background, her face twisted in terror. She was screaming. Her mouth was wide open, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body frozen in place, as though she were trapped inside the photo, unable to escape. "No," she whispered, backing away from the album. "This can't be happening." But it was. She felt it deep in her bones. A heavy weight pressed on her chest, as if the walls of the house themselves were closing in on her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and the low hum of static filled the air, vibrating her very soul. Then she heard it, a voice. Soft at first, almost drowned out by the static, but unmistakable. It was her own voice. "Get out of the house." The words were slow, distorted, and filled with an unbearable dread. "Get out, before it's too late." Her heart pounded in her chest. She scrambled to close the album, but it wouldn't close. The pages kept turning, pulling her in, dragging her deeper into the nightmare. The voices in the pictures grew louder. The figures reached out, their hands clawing at the edges of the frame, trying to pull her in. "You shouldn't have come," the voice echoed, distorted and cold. "It's too late now." Suddenly, the air went still. The room went silent. And then, in the deepest corner of the attic, she saw something move. A figure standing just out of the light. She couldn't make out its shape, but it was there, watching her. She had no time to think. With trembling hands, she slammed the album shut and stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The house groaned, as though reacting to the album's closure, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. With a final, desperate breath, she turned and ran. The sound of her feet hitting the wooden floor echoed through the house, too loud, too frantic. She could feel the weight of the shadows chasing her, as though something was closing in, right on her heels. The hallway stretched out in front of her, but it seemed longer than before, the walls shifting, distorting with every step she took. She could hear the static now, louder, almost deafening, as if the house itself was alive, vibrating with a dark energy. She reached the stairs and grabbed the railing, pulling herself up in a panic. The house creaked and groaned, as if it were alive and fighting back, the very walls closing in around her. She glanced back, her eyes wide with terror. The attic door stood open, its dark interior like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. At the top of the stairs, she ran down the hallway toward her bedroom, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked, no, it was jammed. She twisted the handle in a frantic panic, her breath coming in shallow gasps. From behind her, a voice called out in that same distorted, familiar tone, "You can't escape." The words froze her in place. Her heart stopped for a moment, her blood running cold. She turned slowly, her hands still gripped around the door handle. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood a figure. One she knew too well. It was her, but not her. This version of her was older, her face twisted with fear, her eyes hollow and dark. She was dressed in the same clothes, but there was something wrong about her. A malevolent presence radiated from her, a shadow that moved of its own accord, as if it were no longer bound by the rules of the living. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her, and whispered with a voice that wasn't her own, "You are me. I am you. And now you are trapped." A shriek escaped her lips, but no sound came out. It was as if the air itself had thickened, silencing her. The room behind her seemed to pulse with a dark, unsettling force, the shadows stretching longer, creeping closer. The figures in the photographs, the family she didn't recognize, they had come alive, their faces twisted in agony. They were watching her from every corner of the house, from the walls, from the very air itself. They were all closing in, suffocating her, making it impossible to breathe. With a final, helpless scream, She turned and ran down the stairs, through the hall, out the door, and into the night. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The house was behind her, but its darkness followed, reaching out with cold fingers to pull her back. But the photo album, it was still in there. The static in the air never stopped. Let's start with the next story. It had been a long day, and Sarah was finally able to sit down on the couch, her legs sore from running errands. The house was quiet, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Her daughter, Emma, had gone to bed hours ago, and the silence felt almost too still. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself relax. But then something caught her eye on the kitchen table. A small drawing, half hidden beneath a stack of papers. She didn't recognize it at first, but the more she looked at it, the more familiar it became. It was Emma's drawing. The child's handwriting was clumsy, but there was something about it that made Sarah's stomach tighten. The drawing showed their family, her husband Jack, and Emma. They were smiling, standing together in their living room. It was a simple picture, but there was one thing that made it different. In the corner of the room, near the window, was a figure. It wasn't anyone Sarah knew. It was just a shadowy, vague outline, with no clear features. Her heart skipped a beat. "Emma," she called, her voice shaking slightly. But there was no answer. Emma was already asleep, the house too quiet for a child's restless energy. Sarah sat down at the table and stared at the drawing. The figure was drawn in a darker shade than the rest of the family. Its body wasn't clearly defined, but the eyes, they seemed to be watching her. She felt a chill run down her spine. Why did Emma draw this? She wondered aloud. Her mind raced, but she couldn't come up with any logical explanation. She wasn't a superstitious person, but there was something unnerving about that figure. Jack came into the room just as she was about to reach for the drawing again. He noticed the tension in her face immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked, concerned. Sarah nodded, but her hands were trembling as she handed him the drawing. He took it, raising an eyebrow as he scanned the picture. "That's weird," he muttered. "Emma drew this?" "Yeah," Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "I don't know, but look at that figure in the corner. I don't know who it is." Jack looked at the figure, then at Sarah. He didn't seem as disturbed as she was. Maybe it's just her imagination. Kids draw weird things sometimes, right? Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, after they'd gone to bed, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the drawing. She lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. Just a silly picture drawn by a child with an overactive imagination. But then, as the clock ticked past midnight, Sarah heard something. A soft creak, followed by the faint sound of footsteps. Her heart skipped. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. There it was again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps that sounded like they were coming from the hallway outside their bedroom door. She held her breath, waiting for them to stop. The footsteps didn't sound like Emma's, though. Too heavy, too slow. Then she heard a whisper. A voice. It was soft, almost like a murmur, but it was clear enough for her to make out the words. "Get out!" The blood drained from her face. Her heart pounded in her chest. She waited, too afraid to move, to make a sound. The whisper came again, more forceful this time. "Get out!" Sarah's hands gripped the blankets tightly as her mind raced. The voice, it was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Was it Jack? No, it couldn't be. Jack had been fast asleep beside her. Her pulse quickened. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Complete silence. And then, the creak of the floorboard near the doorway. Sarah's eyes shot to the door, wide with fear. There, standing just at the edge of the doorway, was the figure from the drawing. It was dark, its form shadowed, but she could see it clearly now. It stood there, unmoving, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure seemed to shimmer slightly, its outline hazy, as though it didn't fully belong in the room. It was like it was part of the house itself, part of the walls, part of the darkness that clung to the corners. "Jack!" Sarah gasped, her voice barely a whisper, too terrified to scream. She reached out, shaking her husband awake. "Jack! Wake up!" Jack groggily stirred, lifting his head. His eyes were heavy with sleep, but when he saw the panic on Sarah's face, his expression quickly shifted to one of concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, still half asleep. Sarah pointed at the doorway, but when Jack looked, the figure was gone. There was nothing there. "Sarah, there's nothing there," Jack said, rubbing his eyes. "You're just dreaming. Maybe you're still half asleep." But Sarah knew. She knew what she saw. She lay back down, trembling, but she couldn't sleep. The image of the figure lingered in her mind. It had been there, standing in the doorway, and it was the same figure from Emma's drawing. The same figure that had been watching her family. Sarah lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of the figure. It had felt so real, so close, like it was just beyond the reach of her outstretched hand. Her body was stiff with tension, her eyes wide open, straining to catch any movement in the room. Jack's steady breathing beside her should have been comforting, but it only made the silence around her seem more oppressive. She tried to convince herself that it was just a bad dream, a product of an overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something wrong, something she couldn't quite explain, but she could feel it gnawing at her, just beneath the surface of her thoughts. When morning came, Sarah felt exhausted, drained, like she hadn't slept at all. The sunlight streaming through the window felt harsh, as if it couldn't wash away the chill that had settled into her bones. She stood up slowly, her legs shaky, and made her way to the kitchen. She needed coffee, something to wake her up, to shake off the nightmare that still clung to her like a shadow. Jack was already in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He smiled when he saw her, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well." Jack didn't press further, but she could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He knew her too well. They sat down to breakfast in silence. Sarah kept glancing at the corner of the room, the same spot where the figure had been standing the night before. She couldn't help it. It was like her mind kept returning to that moment, replaying it over and over. The figure, the whisper, the feeling of being watched. After breakfast, Emma came into the kitchen, her small feet padding against the floor. She yawned and rubbed her eyes, still half asleep. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah said, trying to sound cheerful. She bent down to give her daughter a hug, but Emma pulled away, her eyes darting to the corner of the room. "Mommy, who's that man in the corner?" Emma asked in a quiet voice, pointing at the same spot Sarah had been staring at. Sarah's blood ran cold. She froze, not knowing how to respond. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The man standing in the corner," Emma said matter-of-factly, looking at Sarah as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "He's been there ever since I drew him." Sarah's heart stopped. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her stomach. Emma had said it, the exact same thing that had been in the drawing. But the way Emma said it, so casually, made it all the more chilling. "Sweetheart, there's no man in the corner," Sarah said, her voice cracking slightly as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. "What are you talking about?" Emma looked at her as if Sarah were the one who didn't understand. She frowned, her little brow furrowing in confusion. "He's right there, Mommy," Emma insisted, pointing again. "Don't you see him?" Sarah could barely keep herself together. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. She needed to get away from that corner. She needed to leave the house. She needed to forget this was happening, to convince herself it was all just some nightmare. But as she walked past Emma, she caught a glimpse of the drawing on the kitchen counter. It was still there, untouched, the figure in the corner staring at her from the paper. It was as if it were mocking her, daring her to ignore it. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah found herself standing in front of the drawing again, unable to look away. The figure was still there, drawn in dark lines, standing in the corner. But this time, the details were clearer. The figure had a face now, a twisted, distorted face that seemed to be grinning at her from the page. Its eyes were dark, hollow, with a malevolent gleam that made Sarah shudder. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something alive, something that wanted her to see it. "Why did you draw this, Emma?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. But of course, Emma wasn't there to answer. She was asleep, far away from the nightmare her mother was slowly slipping into. Sarah didn't sleep that night, not at all. She kept her eyes on the corner of the room, just waiting for the figure to appear again. But it didn't. Instead, she heard the faintest creak of the floorboard outside her bedroom door, just like before. Soft, deliberate footsteps. But this time they were closer. Her heart began to race. She tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible. The footsteps were unmistakable, and they were moving toward her. Then, the whisper came again, clear and cold in the darkness. "Get out!" The voice was familiar now. It was the same voice she had heard the night before. But this time, it didn't come from the hallway. It came from the other side of the room. It was right behind her. Sarah didn't dare turn around. She couldn't. She was frozen in place, too terrified to move, too terrified to make a sound. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Get out!" Her skin crawled as she felt a chill spread through the air, like ice settling into her bones. She could hear the faintest shuffle of movement behind her, but when she finally turned, there was nothing there. Just the darkness. The oppressive, suffocating darkness. But then she saw it. In the corner of the room, just where the figure had stood in the drawing, it was there again. The same figure. The same twisted face, the same hollow eyes, staring at her from the shadows. And this time it moved. It stepped forward, just a few inches at first, then a few more. Slowly, deliberately, as if it were savoring her fear. "Jack!" Sarah screamed, her voice ragged with panic. But Jack didn't come. There was only silence. The figure stepped forward again, its shadow stretching toward her, and Sarah could feel its presence now, thick and suffocating. It was closing in on her. "Get out!" The whisper was deafening now, as if it were inside her head. Sarah's vision blurred, her breath coming in gasps, her hands trembling. She stumbled backward, but the figure was too close. She could feel its cold, unnatural presence pressing against her, almost like it was trying to merge with her. And then, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, Sarah understood. The figure wasn't just some shadow. It wasn't just something drawn by her daughter. It was real, and it was here. Sarah's mind raced. She stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She felt as if the world was closing in on her, the walls pressing inward, the air growing heavier. The figure, that same twisted thing from Emma's drawing, was moving toward her with unnerving slowness, its hollow eyes fixed on her with a gaze that sent icy dread coursing through her veins. She didn't know what to do. Her limbs were paralyzed with fear, her body unwilling to obey her frantic mind. The figure's feet seemed to glide across the floor without sound, its form shifting, growing darker, as if it were pulling the very light from the room. Sarah couldn't look away, couldn't tear her gaze from it, even though every part of her screamed to run, to escape. "Get out!" The whisper came again, louder now, as though the figure was inside her mind, its voice echoing through the very core of her being. Her vision began to swim, the edges of the room blurring as the figure grew closer, its outline becoming sharper, more defined. Its face twisted into a grotesque grin, its features warping and changing, as if it were not quite human, not quite anything she could comprehend. And then something shifted. It was no longer a figure standing in the corner. It was something else, something alive. Sarah gasped, stumbling back further, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. The figure's limbs stretched unnaturally long, and its fingers twitched with a grotesque jerking motion, as if they were yearning to reach out and grab her. The air grew colder, so cold that Sarah could see her breath fogging in the air. But the chill didn't stop at her skin. It sank deeper, burrowing into her bones, filling her with an overpowering sense of dread. Suddenly, the figure lunged. Sarah didn't have time to scream. She didn't have time to even process what was happening. It was on her in an instant, a dark shadow with eyes full of malevolent hunger. Its hand shot out, grasping her wrist with a force that felt like steel. The cold was unbearable, and she could feel the life draining from her, as if its touch sucked the very warmth from her body. "Get out! It's too late!" The words were no longer a whisper. They were a growl, a rasping, suffocating sound that reverberated in her skull. Her vision began to swim, her mind growing dizzy as the figure's grip tightened, pulling her closer to its distorted form. She could feel its breath on her skin, if it even had breath, and it reeked of something foul like decay. She fought back, her body trembling with fear, her limbs moving instinctively, pushing against the figure's grip. But it was no use. It was too strong. Its grip tightened, and Sarah felt herself being dragged toward the shadow, as though it were pulling her into the darkness itself. "Jack!" she cried out, her voice hoarse and weak. "Please help me." But there was no answer, no sound from the other room. The house was silent, save for the hollow, echoing sound of her own voice. Desperation surged through her. She couldn't just let it take her. She wouldn't let it. With one last, frantic effort, Sarah yanked her arm free from the figure's grasp. She fell backward, her body hitting the floor with a thud. For a moment, everything was still. The figure loomed over her, its eyes boring into hers with an intensity that threatened to crush her spirit. "Leave us alone," Sarah gasped, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she scrambled to her feet. The figure paused, its head tilting to the side, almost curiously. And then, as if it were considering her words, it took a slow, deliberate step back. But it didn't disappear. It remained there, watching her with that twisted, unblinking stare. Sarah took another step back, her eyes never leaving the figure. She couldn't tear her gaze away, couldn't allow herself to look anywhere else, because she knew. She knew that if she did, the figure would be gone, and it would be waiting for her somewhere else. Somewhere far worse. She backed into the wall, her heart racing, her breathing shallow. Her thoughts were a blur. She couldn't think, couldn't focus. She just needed to get out of that room, out of that house, away from whatever nightmare this was. Then, as if on cue, the figure spoke again. "You can't run." The words were cold, final, and Sarah felt a cold shiver run through her entire body. She looked around frantically, her mind struggling to find an escape. The door was too far, the window too high. There was nowhere to go. Suddenly, she remembered the drawing. Emma's drawing. It had shown the family, but there had been something else. Someone else. Someone standing in the corner, watching. The same corner where the figure had appeared. Was it possible? Was it connected somehow? Was this figure, this thing, trapped within the confines of the drawing? Could it have been released, summoned, or called into being? In a flash of desperation, Sarah ran toward the table where the drawing lay. She grabbed it, the paper crinkling under her fingers as she pulled it from the table and held it up in front of her. She stared at the figure in the corner, the twisted grin, the hollow eyes. The very same figure that stood before her now. With trembling hands, she turned the drawing over, hoping for some clue, some answer, but there was nothing. Just the blank back of the paper. It wasn't enough. There had to be something, some way to stop it. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Sarah screamed, spinning around, but it wasn't the figure. It was Jack. He stood there looking at her, his eyes wide with confusion and concern. "Sarah, what's going on?" But Sarah could barely hear him over the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Jack," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's here. The thing from the drawing. The figure, it's real." Jack stepped closer, his face etched with worry. Sarah, you're not making sense. There's nothing there. He reached out to touch her arm, but before his hand could make contact, Sarah felt a sharp chill race up her spine. She turned to face the corner once more. The figure was back, and this time it was closer. The figure was no longer standing in the corner. It had moved, its shadow stretching across the room like a nightmare come to life. Its hollow eyes were locked on Sarah and Jack, and as it slowly crept forward, the temperature in the room dropped further, chilling them to their very bones. The figure's shape seemed to shift, warping like melted wax, its limbs growing and shrinking in an unnatural rhythm. It moved with an eerie fluidity, gliding across the floor, its form growing taller and more distorted as it approached. Jack's voice quivered as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "Sarah, you're scaring me. This isn't real. There's no one there." But Sarah could barely hear him, her eyes fixed on the figure as it drew closer, its twisted grin widening, as though it were savoring their fear. Her throat felt tight, like the very air was being sucked out of the room. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt frozen to the ground, her body paralyzed with terror. The figure stopped a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. Sarah could feel its cold gaze on her skin, crawling beneath her flesh like icy tendrils. She tried to speak, tried to tell Jack what she had seen, but no words came. The figure was the only thing that mattered now, the only thing that existed in the room. Jack, looking around nervously, stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch the air in front of him. "Sarah, I think we should." But before he could finish, the figure suddenly lunged forward with a terrifying speed, its hand shooting out like a whip and wrapping around Jack's wrist. He gasped in pain, struggling to free himself, but the figure's grip was like iron, unyielding. Its grin widened, exposing jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. "Jack!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking as she reached out toward him. But before she could move, the figure twisted its hand, pulling Jack toward it with horrifying force. He stumbled, helplessly trying to break free, but the thing was too strong. It was dragging him into the very shadow it had come from. "No!" Sarah cried out, her voice hoarse, desperate. Her body moved without thinking, lunging toward Jack, her hands outstretched. But the figure was faster. It yanked Jack closer, pulling him off his feet and into the growing darkness in the corner of the room. She reached the spot just in time to see the figure's twisted face loom over Jack. His eyes were wide with terror, but he couldn't move, couldn't scream, as the figure's shadow seemed to consume him. It was swallowing him whole, pulling him into itself, as if the very darkness of the room was alive and hungry. "Jack!" Sarah screamed again, but this time there was no response. No sound, only the cold, suffocating silence. For a moment, the room was still. Then, the figure's gaze turned back to Sarah. Its twisted smile never wavered, but its eyes seemed to gleam with some dark satisfaction, as if it had won. As if it had claimed what it came for. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow and frantic. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped, caught in the grip of something she couldn't understand, something that didn't belong in this world. The figure took a step toward her, its movements slow, deliberate. Each step seemed to pull her deeper into its terrifying presence, and she could feel herself slipping into a state of panic. She had to get out of there, she had to escape. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no escape. Not from this thing, not from what it had become. Suddenly, there was a noise, a sharp, unsettling sound from the other room. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Someone was moving around in the house. "Jack!" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But Jack was gone. He had been swallowed by the figure. The footsteps grew louder, and Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She turned toward the sound, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing. The house was still, too still. A soft whisper filled the room, echoing in Sarah's mind. Get out! Get out while you can. It was Jack's voice. But it wasn't Jack. It was a distorted version, hollow and cold. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere, like a presence she couldn't escape. It was inside her head, inside her heart, wrapping around her mind. Without thinking, Sarah rushed toward the door. She grabbed the handle and yanked it open with all her strength. The hallway beyond was dark, but the faintest sliver of light from the kitchen illuminated her way. She didn't hesitate. She ran, her feet pounding against the floor, her heart racing. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house before the figure came for her next. As she passed through the hallway, she glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. The room she had just left was empty. But she knew. She knew it was still there, watching her, waiting. She stumbled into the kitchen, gasping for breath, her hands shaking. The room was dim, lit only by the faint light from the stove. She ran to the back door, her hands fumbling with the handle, trying to escape. But the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. No, 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 she cried, pounding against it with all her strength. Please. The door remained unyielding. She couldn't leave. She was trapped. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. It's too late. It's too late. Sarah turned, her eyes darting around the kitchen. That's when she saw it. The figure standing in the doorway, just as it had been in the drawing. Its eyes were locked onto hers, its twisted grin widening as it stepped into the room, its shadow stretching across the walls. Her mind raced. She had no escape. There was no way out. No one could save her. She had brought this upon herself. She dropped to her knees, her hands trembling. Please, please don't. But the figure was already there, its hand reaching toward her. And everything went black. Let's start with the next story. Tom sat hunched over his desk, the faint glow of his computer screen illuminating his tired face. It had been a long day of work, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. His email inbox was overflowing, his to-do list was impossibly long, and now his old account was locked. He had forgotten the password again. It had happened before, but this time it felt different. This time he really needed access. Great, Tom muttered to himself. He clicked on the forgot password link beneath the login screen and waited as the website loaded slowly. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he prepared to type in his email address. The usual process began. He was asked for his username and the email address associated with the account. No surprises there. He filled in the information, hit next, and watched as the screen blinked. Security questions, the site said. Tom frowned. He'd forgotten which questions he'd chosen years ago. He was always careful about security, but now he wasn't sure if he could even remember his own answers. The first question appeared. What was the name of your first pet? Tom smiled faintly, the answer coming easily. Buster, he typed. He clicked next and waited for the next question. Okay, that wasn't so bad, he thought to himself. The second question appeared. What is your mother's maiden name? Tom's fingers froze over the keyboard. He could hear his mom's voice in his head. The answer was easy. He typed it quickly, feeling a brief sense of relief. He was making progress. Next, he said to himself. The third question was a little more obscure. What street did you grow up on? He paused, glancing at the calendar on the wall across from his desk. His childhood home. It felt like a lifetime ago, but the memories flooded back quickly. He typed in the street name without thinking too much. All right, let's keep going, he muttered, already moving on to the next part. His fingers moved swiftly as the next page loaded. But this time, the question wasn't familiar. In fact, it made his stomach tighten. Last question, it said. What is your death date? Tom blinked. He had to read the question again. What is your death date? He leaned closer to the screen. The question was worded clearly enough, but it didn't make any sense. His heart began to race. There was no way this could be a standard security question. He stared at the screen, feeling the air in the room suddenly grow heavier. He looked around his small office. The walls seemed to close in. Tom's breathing quickened. The idea of answering such a question, it felt like a bad joke, a sick joke. How was he supposed to answer that? He pushed the thought out of his mind. It had to be some kind of glitch. He thought about clicking away, maybe resetting the whole process and trying again later, but the urge to get access to his account was too strong. The cursor blinked in the empty field. Tom felt the weight of the question pressing on his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. The idea of filling it in felt wrong. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't ignore it forever. His fingers hovered over the keys. His mind scrambled for an answer. He typed slowly, hesitantly, his fingers shaking slightly. "I don't know," he typed, hoping that would work. He hit enter with a shaky breath. But the screen didn't change. The question remained. Instead of offering a simple error message or directing him to try again, the page flickered for a moment, then refreshed. The cursor blinked in the same field. "Please answer the question," the site said again, but the words had changed. The tone of the message now felt cold, demanding. Tom felt his heartbeat in his throat. His head spun. He read the question again. "What is your death date?" The air felt colder now. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something was off. Tom sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't answer this. He couldn't just type something in, and even if he did, how could he know? A thought crossed his mind. Was this a prank? Was someone messing with him? Or was there something else happening? He didn't know, but the chill creeping down his spine made him want to close the browser and never look at the screen again. But as his hand hovered over the mouse, a strange compulsion tugged at him. He had to answer. Why did it feel so urgent? Why did the question seem to haunt him so? He could practically feel its presence in the room, as if the question had taken on a life of its own. "Okay, fine," he whispered to himself. He wasn't going to just sit here forever. He typed in a date. It wasn't random. It was a date he had seen once, a date that had come to him in a dream a long time ago, and it had always stuck with him. Without thinking further, he typed it in and clicked the submit button. Tom stared at the screen, waiting for something to happen. Maybe it would accept it. Maybe it would reject him. Either way, he needed to get back to his life. He needed to get back to work. But the screen didn't change. He stared at it for what felt like minutes, but nothing happened. He thought maybe there was a glitch, but deep down, a sense of dread crept into him, telling him that whatever had just occurred was not normal. Then suddenly the screen flickered again. This time, the website didn't just refresh, it went black. For a split second, Tom thought his computer had shut down, but then a new message appeared. "Thank you, Tom. We'll see you soon." His blood ran cold. Tom's heart pounded as he stared at the words on the screen. "We'll see you soon." The message was simple, but it felt like a warning, an ominous promise. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process what he had just read. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of joke, some weird glitch. He reached for the mouse, his hand trembling. His fingers hovered over the mouse for a moment, and he slowly clicked the mouse button, hoping it would take him back to the home page or prompt him to try again. But nothing happened. The screen remained black. The words "Thank you, Tom. We'll see you soon" stared back at him, mocking him in their simplicity. He moved the mouse frantically, clicking and dragging across the screen, trying to get any response. Nothing. Tom's breath became shallow. His pulse raced as an unsettling feeling began to settle deep in his chest. This was no glitch. This wasn't a simple error message. The way the website had reacted, the cold, calculated tone of the message, it wasn't normal. He reached for his phone, quickly typing a message to his friend, Dave. "Hey, something's weird happening on my account. I think it's been hacked. I can't get back into it." His fingers were shaking so much that he had trouble typing. His mind kept returning to the question he had just answered. What is your death date? Why had he typed that date? Why had it felt so right? It wasn't even a date he'd thought about in years, but it had come to him so easily, so naturally, that he hadn't hesitated. A sudden ringing sound filled the room. It came from his phone. Tom jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He quickly looked at the screen. It was a call from an unknown number. His hand trembled as he accepted the call, bringing the phone to his ear. "Hello?" Tom asked, his voice shaky. A long pause followed, too long. He almost thought the call had dropped when a voice finally answered. "Hello, Tom," the voice said. It was low and smooth, almost too smooth, as if it wasn't entirely human. It sent a shiver down his spine. Tom's mouth went dry. "Who is this?" The voice laughed, a deep, unsettling laugh that echoed in his ear. "You don't recognize me, Tom? I'm hurt." Tom's breath hitched. "What do you want?" "Oh, I don't want anything, Tom. I just wanted to make sure you're ready. It's all set up now. The clock is ticking." Tom's mind raced, his thoughts spinning. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. 1,000 questions flooded his mind, but the only thing he could focus on was the strange, menacing tone of the voice on the other end of the line. "What clock?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause. Then the voice answered, slow and deliberate. "The one you started when you answered the question, Tom. The clock to your end. It's counting down, and it's nearly out of time." The blood drained from Tom's face. His hand tightened around the phone, and his entire body went cold. "What do you mean? This is insane. Who are you? What do you want?" Another laugh, colder this time, echoed in his ear. "Don't worry, Tom. You'll find out soon enough." The call abruptly ended, leaving Tom standing there, holding the phone, his mind racing. The silence that followed was deafening. His thoughts swirled around him as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Dave. "You good? I can help with your account if you want." Tom stared at the message, but the words felt hollow. His fingers shook as he typed a quick response. "Something is wrong. I don't know what's happening, but I think I need to get offline." He quickly shut his laptop, trying to shake the image of that strange message from his mind. "We'll see you soon." The words echoed in his head like a chant, each repetition making his heart race faster. He needed to calm down. He needed to breathe. Tom tried to focus on anything else. He took a long breath, pushing aside the dread that was slowly consuming him. He needed to get control of his thoughts. The world outside his small office seemed quiet, peaceful even. The night was calm. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. But then something caught his eye. He froze. The shadows in the room, they were moving. Tom's eyes widened. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable, but there. The shadow in the corner of the room was shifting, undulating. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, thinking it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, it was still there. A figure in the corner of his room. His breath caught in his throat. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, that the stress of the night had gotten to him. But the figure was still there, standing perfectly still, blending with the darkness in the corner. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice trembling. He didn't know who or what he was calling to. The air in the room grew thick with tension. No answer. Tom felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he stood frozen in place, staring at the shadow. His legs felt like they were glued to the floor. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, to get away, but his body wouldn't respond. He could feel the figure watching him. Its presence was suffocating. Suddenly the figure shifted. It stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Tom's blood ran cold. The figure was unmistakably human, but something was wrong. It wasn't quite right. The shape was off, the proportions distorted, as if it didn't quite belong to this world. Tom opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his body paralyzed by fear. The figure took another step closer, and then it spoke. "Tom," it whispered. The voice was the same. It was the same voice he had just heard on the phone. The figure took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Tom's heart raced, his chest tightening with each breath. He backed away instinctively, but his legs felt like they were trapped in cement. His mind screamed at him to move, to escape, but all he could do was watch as the figure inched closer, its presence growing more suffocating with every passing second. The thing in front of him was almost human, but its features were blurred, shifting like a mirage. The outline of its face was indistinct, as if the very air around it refused to hold its shape. The figure's eyes were hollow, dark, endless pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. "Tom," it whispered again, its voice low and rasping, just like the voice on the phone. "You've been waiting for me." Tom tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry. His body trembled uncontrollably as he took another step back. What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its features warping as it moved, its form more fluid than human. "I want nothing from you, Tom. But you've already given me everything." Tom's throat tightened, panic flooding through him. His mind raced back to the strange question on the website, the one he had answered so easily, without thinking. "What is your death date?" The figure smiled, though it was not a smile that conveyed warmth or comfort. It was a smile that chilled him to the bone, a smile that made him feel small and insignificant. "I know you're scared," the figure said, its voice now like a soft breath against his ear. "But you won't escape this. You've sealed your fate." Tom's stomach lurched. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no words would come. His body was frozen, unable to break free from the paralyzing grip of fear. You can't be real," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure's smile widened, and it stepped even closer, closing the distance between them. "You already knew, didn't you? The date you gave me, your death date. It's the only truth that matters now." Tom's eyes widened in horror. The date, the one he'd written without thinking, without even second-guessing it. It was the date he had always known deep down, but had never been able to explain. The date of his death. It had been a whisper in the back of his mind, a vague memory, something he couldn't ignore. "You knew the moment you answered," the figure murmured. "You knew that once you confirmed it, the countdown had begun." Tom staggered backward, his legs shaking beneath him. His breath came in short gasps. He looked around the room, desperately searching for something, anything, that could offer him a way out, a way to escape. But all he saw were the shadows, the cold walls that seemed to close in around him. The figure reached out, a skeletal hand emerging from the shifting darkness. It was cold, so cold that it sent a shiver down Tom's spine. It grazed his arm, and the touch burned like ice. "Your time is running out, Tom," it whispered. Tom's mind screamed. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The figure was right there, too close, its presence too overwhelming. He had to break free. He had to do something. He tried to gather his thoughts, to think of any way to stop this, but the only thing that rang through his mind was the date that had been given to him, the date that seemed to be his doom. "Please no," he begged, his voice hoarse with fear. "Please, I don't want this. I didn't mean to." The figure's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with unnatural strength. Its fingers were like icy claws, digging into his flesh. "You've already chosen, Tom. You sealed it when you answered. Now we wait." Tom's heart thudded in his chest, the pain in his arm igniting a surge of panic. He struggled, but the figure's grip was unyielding. His mind raced, thinking of a way to break free, but nothing seemed possible. The air felt thick, suffocating. The room, once familiar, now felt like a cage, closing in on him from all sides. "You can't escape fate," the figure whispered, its voice growing more distant, like it was slipping into the depths of his mind. "It's too late for you." The words felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. Tom could feel the coldness seeping deeper into his body, spreading from the place where the figure's hand held him. His skin felt like ice, his body no longer his own. The room grew darker. The figure's form was shifting, becoming more and more indistinct, blending with the shadows. Its presence lingered, though, heavy and suffocating, like a storm waiting to break. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps as the darkness crept closer, surrounding him. He wanted to cry out, to beg for mercy, but no sound escaped his lips. His chest tightened with fear, with hopelessness. "You can't escape," the figure's voice echoed, the words like a chant. "The clock is ticking." Tom's vision blurred, his consciousness slipping in and out of focus. The room seemed to distort around him, warping, shifting, as if reality itself was being torn apart. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the figure's hollow eyes staring at him, unblinking. And then, the world went silent. Tom's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. His body felt like it was suspended in time, as though his very soul had been severed from his physical form. The silence around him was deafening, a heavy, unnatural stillness that pressed against his eardrums. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but all he could see was an oppressive, swirling darkness. He tried to move, but his limbs felt as though they were made of lead. There was no feeling, no sensation, only the creeping cold that had consumed him. His mouth was dry, and the air tasted thick, like dust or decay. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. Something tugged at the edges of his consciousness, pulling him toward the darkness. He felt it, like an invisible force dragging him deeper, further away from the world he had known. The air around him began to shift, moving like an unseen current, swirling and swirling, suffocating him with its density. And then, as if from nowhere, a voice whispered in the blackness. It was the same voice, the voice he had heard so many times, the voice that had lured him into answering the question, "What is your death date?" "Tom," the voice breathed. "You're almost there." His breath caught in his throat, his chest aching. He tried to push the voice away, to shut it out, but it filled his mind, echoing through every corner of his being. The words, that question, it was all that mattered now, all that had led him to this point. He had known deep down that something was wrong, that something had changed when he answered. The question had been a warning. A trap. "No," he tried to say, but it was only a rasping whisper. "This can't be real." But the voice only chuckled softly, a low, hollow sound that sent shivers down his spine. "It's real, Tom. Everything about this is real. Your fate, your death date, it's already written. And now there's no escape." The dark space around him began to shift again. The cold, the silence, it all began to warp into something else. The air thickened, like it was becoming tangible, like he could reach out and touch it. The walls of the invisible space began to fold inward, suffocating him with each passing second. Tom's breathing quickened, panic overtaking him as he clawed at the empty air, desperate for something solid to hold on to. But there was nothing. The voice returned, low and taunting. "You should have known, Tom. You should have listened. There's no undoing it now." The pressure around him intensified, crushing him from all sides. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as if they couldn't get enough. He could feel the coldness seeping deeper into his skin, into his very bones. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance, flickering like a candle's flame, weak and distant. Tom strained his eyes, trying to focus, desperate for something to hold on to, something to escape the suffocating darkness. The voice spoke again, this time softer, almost like a soothing whisper. "It's almost time, Tom. The light is waiting for you." He could feel the pull now, stronger than ever, as though the light was calling to him. It wasn't warm, it wasn't comforting, but it was there, a beacon in the oppressive void. Something in his gut told him he needed to reach it, that this was his only chance. With every ounce of strength he had left, Tom pushed himself toward the light, his movements slow, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. The cold clung to him, dragging him back, but he fought against it. He had to get to the light. He had to. As he drew closer, the flickering grew brighter, sharper, until it was blinding. The pressure around him began to ease, the weight lifting ever so slightly. It felt like air again, like he could finally breathe. But then, just as he was about to reach it, the voice spoke again. "Not yet, Tom." His heart skipped a beat. He froze, every muscle in his body locking into place. His hands trembled at his sides, his eyes fixed on the blinding light that now seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. "You have to face it, Tom," the voice whispered. "Face the truth." The light seemed to flicker, then dim, as though the very source of it was fading. Tom's chest tightened, a panic rising in him as he realized the light was slipping away. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the fading glow, but it was already gone. The darkness around him deepened, suffocating him once more. And then, in the silence, there was only the voice. "You can't outrun this, Tom. It's your death date. You can't change that. You were always meant to know." Tom's blood ran cold, and the terror flooded his mind again. The reality of it hit him like a slap to the face. He had always known, in the back of his mind, that this day would come. That question, the one he had answered so easily, it had been the start of his end. And now, there was no escape. He had sealed his fate. Suddenly, everything around him shattered. The darkness, the cold, the void, all of it broke apart in an instant, like glass being crushed underfoot. Tom felt the force of it, felt himself being pulled into something, into the unknown. And then, everything stopped. He stared at the screen, his fingers trembling over the keys. The final question blinked at him like a warning. "What is your death date?" His heart pounded. He couldn't move, couldn't think, only stare at the words, as if they were some sort of cruel joke. But they weren't. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a glitch in the system. This was real, and the implications were slowly sinking in. How could the system know such a thing? How could anyone, anything, know the answer to a question like that? The cursor on the screen blinked, waiting for him to type his response. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His palms were slick with sweat. He thought of closing the window, of walking away from it all, but he couldn't. The question held him in place, keeping him captive, forcing him to think. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the desk. He flinched, the sound of it nearly making him jump out of his skin. He picked it up quickly, his hands shaking. The screen showed an unknown number. Without thinking, he answered. "Hello." There was no response. Just the sound of heavy breathing, like someone was on the other side of the line, just waiting. Then, as if they'd been waiting for him to pick up, a voice whispered in his ear. "Answer the question." The voice was quiet, cold, and unmistakably familiar. It sent a chill down his spine. He froze, unable to speak, unable to even breathe. It was his own voice, but distorted somehow, twisted. It echoed in his ears like a dark reflection of himself. He lowered the phone from his ear slowly, staring at the screen once more. The question blinked back at him. "What is your death date?" His mind raced. Could he just type something random? Could he just lie? But then, what would happen? Would it lock him out of the account forever? Would it do something worse? The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like there was no escape. He stared at the blinking cursor for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the question pressing on his chest. Finally, his fingers moved, typing out the only answer he could think of. October 27th, 2025. There was no immediate response. The screen remained still, dark. The cursor blinked once, twice, before the screen suddenly went black. For a moment, the room was silent. Only the hum of the computer and the steady beat of his heart filled the air. He let out a breath, a mixture of relief and confusion. Had he done it? Was it over? Then, a single line of text appeared on the screen. One simple sentence that sent a jolt of terror through his entire body. "You will not survive until your death date." The words burned into his mind. His heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, to get up from his chair, but his body wouldn't respond. It felt as if the air in the room had thickened, suffocating him. He looked around, but everything seemed to be exactly as it had been. No sign of anyone or anything out of place. But then, as if in response to his panic, the temperature in the room dropped. His breath came out in visible puffs of mist, swirling in the cold air. The computer screen flickered back to life, but this time it showed something else. A series of images, blurred, indistinct. Shadows moving across his room. The outline of a figure standing by his door. It wasn't clear, but he could feel the presence. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, in the icy chill that was now spreading through his body. And then the voice came again, that distorted whisper, now coming from the speakers of the computer. You should have never asked. The screen flickered again, and for a split second, he thought he saw something familiar. It was him, standing by his own door. His heart skipped in his chest. The figure in the image was wearing the same clothes, had the same hair, the same face, but there was something wrong. The face was too pale. The eyes were too wide, too empty. It moved. No, it was moving toward him. He gasped, scrambling back from the desk. But it was too late. The lights in the room flickered. The shadows seemed to stretch, twist, and distort as if they were alive. The air grew heavier, thicker, suffocating him. And in the corner of the room, in the spot where the figure had always been, he saw it. A figure, standing in the dark, staring at him with hollow eyes. It wasn't him. It wasn't anyone he knew. It was something else entirely. The last thing he heard before the world went dark was the sound of a low, guttural laugh. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.